525 BC, a Persian king named Cambyses sends 50,000 soldiers into the Egyptian desert to raise a single oracle, and not one of them is ever seen again. No survivors, no bodies, not even a rumor with real weight behind it, just a Greek historian writing down what Egyptian priests told him decades later. How does something that large simply disappear? It's the kind of question historians return to again and again, because every explanation creates another problem. The evidence is incomplete. The witnesses are centuries removed. The landscape itself has erased most of what was left behind. Sometimes history doesn't hide its answers. It destroys them. An army walked into the sand first. Everything else follows from there. The desert of the Great Sand Sea stretches westward from the Nile, an ocean of dunes that shifts and reshapes itself with every wind. There is no shade here, no water, no permanent thing at all, except perhaps for what may still lie beneath the sand, undisturbed for 25 centuries. Somewhere in this vastness, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, an army of 50,000 men simply ceased to exist. The year was 525 BC. Cambyses II, king of Persia and son of Cyrus the Great, had just conquered Egypt. Flush with victory, he turned his ambitions toward the oasis of Siwa, home to the Oracle of Amun, a religious site whose authority even Egyptian pharaohs respected. Herodotus tells us that Cambyses, perhaps threatened by the oracle's influence, perhaps seeking its blessing for further conquest, dispatched a force of 50,000 soldiers from Thebes to march across the desert and destroy the temple. They never arrived. According to Herodotus, writing decades after the events he described, the army made it roughly halfway before a violent sandstorm rose from the south. The wind, he wrote, came suddenly and with such force that the soldiers were swallowed up, buried beneath the dunes, never to be seen again. No survivors returned to report what happened. No Persian record confirms it. The only account we have is secondhand, gathered from Egyptian priests who told the story to a Greek traveler long after the fact. Is it true? Historians have debated this question for over 2,000 years. Skeptics point out the obvious problems. Herodotus, often called the father of history, has also been called the father of lies. A storyteller as much as a chronicler, prone to repeating tales without verifying them. No Persian sources mention the disaster at all, a curious silence for an empire that meticulously documented its military campaigns. Some scholars suggest the army may not have been destroyed by nature at all, but ambushed by desert tribes, or that it simply deserted or was reassigned, its disappearance from the historical record a matter of politics rather than catastrophe. And yet the desert has offered tantalizing fragments that keep the story alive. In 1977, geologist Tom Brown claimed to have located what he believed was the Lost Army's path, though further excavation was never completed. Decades later, in 2009, two Italian archaeologists, the Castiglione brothers, announced the discovery of bronze weapons, human bones, and a silver bracelet in the Egyptian desert, artifacts they believed pointed to the remains of Cambyses' lost soldiers. The Egyptian government disputed the claim, and no conclusive proof followed. The desert once again gave up only questions. What makes this mystery endure is not simply the absence of an answer, but the scale of what would need to disappear for the story to be false or true. 50,000 men, their equipment, their supplies, an entire military force swallowed by geography or erased from memory. Could a sandstorm truly bury an army so completely that no trace would surface for millennia? The Sahara is capable of extraordinary things. Shifting dunes have swallowed entire settlements before. But an army of this size, marching with purpose toward a specific destination, vanishing without a single confirmed skeleton, a single verified weapon cache, a single Persian record of mourning or inquiry. Perhaps the truth lies buried somewhere beneath the dunes, waiting for the wind to shift once more. Or perhaps it was never buried at all, only rewritten, misremembered, or invented by a storyteller separated from the events by 2 generations and an ocean of hearsay. The desert does not answer. It only keeps. And so the question remains, unresolved after 25 centuries, did 50,000 men vanish beneath the sand? Or did they vanish first, into legend? Whose heads were severed, and why? That question was left standing in the silence of Sanxingdui, unanswered by any inscription, any name, any surviving voice from the people who buried them. It is a peculiar kind of mystery, one built not around what remains, but around what refuses to explain itself. And it is a mystery that returns in a different form, roughly 1,000 miles and 8 centuries away, in a room overlooking the Euphrates, where another body would soon become the center of a question just as unanswerable, though for entirely different reasons. This time, the body itself would vanish, along with any certainty about how or why it came to be there in the first place. The room, as later writers described it, overlooked the Euphrates. Warm night air, heavy with the scent of the river. A man lying on a couch, sweating through a fever that would not break, surrounded by generals who had followed him to the edges of the known world and had never once seen him unable to stand. This was June of 323 BC. The man was 32 years old, and he was, by any measure history has ever produced, one of the most powerful human beings who had ever lived. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, had done what no one before him had done. He had inherited a kingdom from his father, avenged an ancient grudge against the Persian Empire, and then simply kept going, further than anyone expected, further perhaps than he himself had planned. Egypt fell to him without a fight. Persia's throne became his. His armies crossed into India, stopping only when his own soldiers, not his enemies, refused to march any further. By 30, he ruled a territory stretching from Greece to the Himalayas, a domain assembled in barely a decade, unmatched in speed and scale by anything the ancient world had witnessed. And then, in Babylon, he began to die. The accounts that survive, written by men like Plutarch and Arrian, working from earlier sources now lost, describe roughly 2 weeks of decline. A fever, sharp abdominal pain, according to some versions, a gradual loss of the ability to speak, and finally, of the ability to move at all. His soldiers, the story goes, were allowed to file past his bed one final time, and Alexander, unable to lift his head, could reportedly only move his eyes to acknowledge them. He died on either the 10th or the 11th of June, 323 BC. And history has been arguing about why ever since. The most immediate explanation, and the one most historians default to, is disease. Babylon in early summer was no stranger to fever-bearing illness, and Alexander had spent over a decade pushing his body through campaigns, wounds, and exhaustion that would have broken most men years earlier. Malaria is frequently proposed. The region was known for it, and the symptoms described align reasonably well. Typhoid fever is another leading candidate, and in 1998, a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine argued for exactly that diagnosis based on the surviving descriptions of his final days. But here is where the certainty begins to erode. Some ancient sources, even at the time, suspected poison. Alexander had no shortage of enemies, and more troublingly, no shortage of people close to him with something to gain from his death. His empire had no clear heir. His marriage to Roxana had not yet produced a surviving son at the time of his death. His generals, men like Ptolemy, Cassander, and Perdiccas, would spend the next 4 decades tearing his empire apart in a series of wars fought explicitly over who would inherit what he left behind. Ancient rumor pointed specifically at Antipater, a general Alexander had grown to distrust, and Antipater's son Iollas, who reportedly served Alexander his wine in his final days. Strychnine, hellebore, and other poisons known to the ancient world have all been proposed by later historians attempting to reconstruct what might have been used. Is it plausible? Perhaps. But it is worth noting that ancient poisoning accusations were common political theater, a way to explain any sudden death of the powerful, whether true or not. The absence of certainty here is not a modern problem. It began the moment Alexander stopped breathing. Then there are the theories that sit further from the mainstream, offered not as settled fact, but as possibilities that refuse to be entirely dismissed. Some modern researchers have proposed Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder that could explain a specific and unsettling detail buried in the ancient accounts. The claim that Alexander's body reportedly showed no signs of decomposition for nearly a week after death, in the heat of a Babylonian summer. If accurate, this detail suggests he may not have technically died when everyone around him believed he had, but instead lay in a paralyzed state, still alive, while the men around him prepared for a funeral. Other theories point to West Nile virus, or a perforated ulcer, or simply the compounded toll of alcohol, old wounds, and physical collapse after years of non-stop campaigning. We are left, in the end, with a body that was examined by no modern physician in an era with no forensic science, described secondhand by writers working from sources written decades, sometimes centuries, after the fact. Even the location of his final resting place is unknown. Alexander's body was eventually moved to Alexandria, visited by later figures like Julius Caesar and Augustus, and then, at some point during the chaos of the following centuries, lost. Not hidden, not destroyed as far as anyone knows, simply lost, misplaced somewhere in the long unraveling of empires and cities that followed him. So we are asked to solve a death without a body, using descriptions filtered through generations of retelling, in a city that itself no longer fully exists. Was it fever, working exactly as fevers do, ending a body pushed too far for too long? Was it poison, slipped quietly into a cup by a hand that had every reason to want him gone? Or was it something stranger still? The body of the most powerful man in the ancient world lying in a room in Babylon, technically alive, while the world outside had already begun preparing to divide everything he had built. The river still moves past where Babylon once stood. The palace is gone. The body was never found. And the question that has followed Alexander for over 2,000 years remains exactly where it started. What or who ended the reign of a man who conquered nearly everything? Except, it seems, the manner of his own death. The river still moves past where Babylon once stood. That much survives, even if the body never did. Rivers have a way of outlasting the men who build empires along their banks, carrying silt and sediment and centuries of accumulated silence downstream, burying what came before under layer after patient layer. It is exactly this kind of burial, slow, mineral, indifferent, that eventually closed over a very different set of remains, thousands of miles east, where the earth had been quietly keeping its own secret for 3,000 years before anyone thought to dig. The site is called Sanxingdui, 3-star mounds, named for a trio of earthen rises in China's Sichuan province that locals had walked past for generations without knowing what lay beneath them. In the spring of 1929, a farmer's shovel struck jade buried in soil that had, until that moment, given no indication it was hiding anything at all. It would take nearly 60 years, and a construction crew digging a brick factory in 1986 before the world understood what that farmer had actually found the edge of. What archaeologists eventually uncovered there did not simply add a new chapter to Chinese history. It rewrote the opening pages entirely. For decades, the accepted narrative of Chinese civilization ran in a fairly straight line. The Yellow River Valley to the north, the Shang and Zhou dynasties, a single cradle from which Chinese culture was believed to have spread outward. Sanxingdui broke that narrative apart. Here in the Sichuan Basin, archaeologists found evidence of an advanced, wealthy, and entirely distinct culture, dated to roughly 1200 to 1000 BC, contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty, but stylistically almost nothing like it. Bronze casting of extraordinary sophistication. Gold, ivory, transported from hundreds of miles away, and faces, masks and figures unlike anything found anywhere else in the ancient world, with towering eyes that seem to extend outward from the face itself, some accounts describing them as almost cylindrical, staring out at nothing. Who were these people? Even now, we don't fully know. No written language has been recovered from the site. No texts, no names, no king lists. An entire civilization, wealthy enough to command gold and bronze on a massive scale, and yet it left behind no words at all, only objects and questions. And then there are the pits. 2 sacrificial pits discovered in 1986 contained the objects that made Sanxingdui famous. The bronze masks, the gold scepters, a bronze tree over 13 feet tall, its branches once hung with birds and fruit cast in metal. But the objects were not simply placed in the ground. They were broken first, deliberately smashed, then burned, then buried in what appears to have been a single coordinated event or a series of them. Why destroy such wealth before burying it? Was it an offering to the gods, meant to release the object's power through fire, in the way sacrifices in many ancient cultures were consumed by flame before reaching the divine? Was it the aftermath of conquest, a rival civilization erasing the symbols of the one it had defeated? Or was it something closer to abandonment, a culture leaving under pressure, destroying what it could not carry and burying what it could not destroy? It's the human remains, however, that keep researchers awake the longest. Among the bronze and jade, archaeologists have documented skeletal remains showing signs of decapitation, bodies separated from skulls in patterns that suggest deliberate ritual rather than accident or ordinary burial practice. In a civilization that left no written record to explain itself, a decapitated skeleton does not answer questions. It only asks more of them. Were these the remains of sacrificial victims, offered alongside the bronze and gold in a ritual we no longer have the vocabulary to fully understand? Were they enemies of the state, executed and displayed as a warning? Or captives from a conquered rival, their deaths part of a religious or political ceremony whose meaning died with the people who practiced it? Mainstream archaeology tends to favor the ritual explanation. Sanxingdui's culture appears, from the objects alone, to have been intensely religious, oriented around sun worship, sacrifice, and communication with forces its people considered divine. The eyes on those bronze masks, some researchers argue, may represent exactly that. A visual language of seeing beyond the ordinary world, watching for gods or ancestors the way a shaman might in trance. Under that reading, the decapitated remains fit within a broader, coherent system of belief, however unfamiliar it feels today. But coherence is not the same as certainty, and in the absence of written records, every explanation remains to some degree an educated guess dressed up as a conclusion. It is this same absence of certainty that has allowed more speculative theories to take root at the edges of Sanxingdui's story. Ideas rarely embraced by mainstream archaeologists, but persistent nonetheless, largely because of those eyes. The exaggerated, protruding gaze of the bronze masks has led some to ask, only half seriously, whether the site's imagery reflects contact with something, or someone, outside conventional explanation. Most researchers dismiss this outright, pointing instead to established artistic and religious traditions of ritual exaggeration found throughout the ancient world. But the theory persists in popular imagination precisely because Sanxingdui offers so few hard answers to push back against it. A civilization without a name defends itself poorly against speculation. What we're left with, ultimately, is a site full of extraordinary craftsmanship and extraordinarily little explanation. A people who could cast bronze on a scale rivaling any civilization of their era, who valued gold and jade and ivory brought from great distances, who built a tree of metal over 13 feet tall, and who, at some point, smashed their own treasures, severed the heads of their dead or their enemies, and buried everything together in pits that would not be reopened for 3,000 years. Excavations at Sanxingdui are still ongoing. New pits have been uncovered as recently as 2021, yielding further masks, further bronze, further silence, where a name or a written record might once have been. So the questions remain exactly where the bronze eyes left them, staring outward into a room, a valley, a history that has yet to answer back. What civilization builds such wealth only to destroy it deliberately? And whose heads were separated from their bodies in that ancient act of ritual, willing sacrifice or silenced enemy, 3,000 years before anyone would think to ask? Wind moves across a stretch of Sicilian coastline, carrying salt and dry grass and the faint metallic scent of turned earth. Beneath this soil, in rows too orderly to be accidental, lie the dead. Hundreds of them, their bones angled together in patterns that archaeologists would spend years trying to read. Some of these men were buried with dignity, laid out carefully, weapons at their sides. Others were thrown into pits, tangled together, without ceremony at all. This is Himera, on the northern coast of Sicily, and the dead beneath it have a story to tell, if only their bones could speak the language of what happened to them. In 480 BC, Himera was a Greek colony standing at the edge of a much larger conflict. Carthage, the powerful North African city-state, had sent a massive invasion force to Sicily, and Himera stood directly in its path. The battle that followed, the First Battle of Himera, became legendary in the ancient world, remembered by Greek historians as a triumph on par with the more famous Greek victories against Persia happening on the other side of the Mediterranean that same year. The Carthaginian forces were routed. Their general, Hamilcar, was said to have died in the fighting, or by his own hand rather than face defeat. Accounts differ. For the Greeks of Sicily, it became a foundational story, a moment when their cities stood united against an overwhelming invader, and won. Then, 70 years later, Carthage returned. In 409 BC, a second battle was fought at Himera, and this time the outcome reversed itself entirely. The city fell. According to ancient accounts, the surviving population was slaughtered in what was later framed as retribution. Vengeance, some Carthaginian sources claimed, for Hamilcar's death decades earlier. Himera, once a symbol of Greek resilience, was destroyed and never fully rebuilt. Two battles, 70 years apart, on the same stretch of coastline. And beginning in the early 2000s, archaeologists started uncovering the physical evidence of both. What they found was extraordinary in scale. Mass graves containing the remains of well over 100 soldiers, arranged in careful rows, accompanied by grave goods and evidence of formal burial rites. Remains researchers believe correspond to the Greek dead of the first battle in 480 BC, honored and interred by their own people after the victory. But nearby, archaeologists also uncovered other pits entirely different in character. Bodies thrown in without care, without weapons, without any of the ceremony given to the first group. Some researchers have connected these disordered burials to the second battle in 409 BC, when the city fell and its defenders were killed rather than honored. The bones themselves have offered details no ancient text preserved. Isotopic analysis conducted on the remains, examining the chemical signatures locked into tooth enamel, which record where a person spent their childhood, produced a genuinely startling result. A significant number of the soldiers buried at Himera, especially among those linked to the second battle, were not native to Sicily, or even to Greece, at all. Their isotopic signatures matched populations from far outside the Mediterranean world Herodotus and Diodorus described, places as distant as Eastern Europe and beyond. Ancient historians had written that Himera's defenders included mercenaries, hired soldiers brought in to bolster the city's forces. The bones appear to confirm it, in a way no inscription ever could. Silent men, recruited from distant lands, dying far from anywhere they might have called home, for a city that may not have been theirs to defend in any sense beyond a contract and a wage. This is where the historical record and the physical evidence align neatly, mainstream, and well supported. But Himera has not given up all of its questions so easily. Why were some of the dead treated with such evident care, arranged deliberately, given grave goods and formal rites, while others, seemingly from the same conflicts, were discarded without ceremony into disordered pits? Battlefield chaos alone doesn't fully explain a pattern this consistent. Some researchers have proposed that burial treatment tracked status or citizenship, that native Himeran soldiers received honors denied to foreign mercenaries, even in death, a hierarchy that followed men from the battlefield into the ground itself. Others suggest the disordered graves may reflect the panic and destruction of the Second Battle specifically, when the city had no time, and perhaps no survivors left, to bury its dead with any care at all. And then there is the matter of the temple. Ancient sources describe the Carthaginians executing 3,000 prisoners after the Second Battle, reportedly as a ritual sacrifice at the very spot where Hamilcar was said to have died decades earlier. Human lives offered in a kind of delayed, generational vengeance. Archaeologists have not definitively located remains that confirm this specific account, and some scholars question whether the number was exaggerated by ancient historians eager to cast Carthage as uniquely brutal. But if the story holds even a kernel of truth, it means the ground beneath Himera may still be holding evidence of an act of mass ritual killing that ancient writers were reluctant to look away from, yet modern archaeology has not yet been able to fully verify. The wind continues to move across that Sicilian coastline today, over soil that has already surrendered hundreds of its dead and may yet be concealing more. Every isotope tested, every burial pattern mapped, answers one question only to open another beside it. Who decided which of Himera's dead deserved a name and a ritual, and which did not? And beneath a hillside that has already given up so much, what remains of that ancient act of vengeance? 3,000 lives, if the old accounts are to be believed, still waiting, unconfirmed, in ground archaeologists have not yet finished searching. There's a particular kind of dread that comes not from what vengeance destroys, but from what indifference does, when the ground itself, without warning or grievance, simply decides to take a city back. Himera fell to armies who could at least be named, blamed, understood. What happened on the northern coast of the Peloponnese one night in 373 BC had no army at all, and perhaps that is what makes it linger longer in the imagination than almost any siege. The Gulf of Corinth is calm most days, its waters a deep, uneventful blue stretching between the mountains of central Greece and the Peloponnesian coastline. Fishermen work these waters as they have for thousands of years, and for much of that time, some of them have told a peculiar story, that on certain days when the light hits the water just right, the remains of an ancient city can still be seen beneath the surface, columns and foundations resting on the seabed where a thriving Greek city once stood. That city was called Helike, and its disappearance is one of the best documented catastrophes to come out of the ancient Greek world, which somehow makes it stranger, not less so. Helike was, by every ancient account, no minor settlement. It was the leading city of Achaia, wealthy enough to have founded colonies in southern Italy, important enough to host a major sanctuary to Poseidon, god of the sea, and, notably, of earthquakes. Ancient writers including Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Pausanias all recorded its fate, and their accounts largely agree on the essential facts, however unsettling those facts remain. In the winter of 373 BC, in the space of a single night, Helike ceased to exist. Ancient sources describe a sequence of events that reads almost like a warning ignored. In the days before the disaster, observers reported strange behavior among local wildlife. Accounts describe mice, snakes, and other creatures fleeing the area en masse in the days prior, a detail that appears across multiple ancient writers and has drawn considerable interest from modern seismologists, since unusual animal behavior preceding earthquakes remains a genuinely documented, if still poorly understood, phenomenon today. Then came the earthquake itself, violent enough by ancient accounts to level the city's buildings within moments. And then, compounding the catastrophe, a tsunami rolled in from the Gulf of Corinth, moving inland and finishing what the earthquake had begun. By morning, ancient writers claim, there was nothing left to bury. The city, along with what may have been its entire population, had simply been swallowed by the sea. For centuries, this account existed as legend more than history, a dramatic story preserved in classical texts, but without physical confirmation. Some scholars questioned whether the destruction had been as total and as sudden as ancient writers described, or whether the story had been shaped and dramatized over generations of retelling, the way disaster stories so often are. Then, in 2001, a team of Greek and American archaeologists, led by Dora Katsonopoulou, announced they had located the remains of Helike. Not beneath the sea, as legend and centuries of assumption had suggested, but buried beneath a coastal lagoon in layers of river sediment, several meters below the surface of what is now agricultural land near the modern town of Rhodia. The city, it turned out, had not simply vanished into the Gulf of Corinth as fishermen's tales suggested. It had subsided and been buried in place, sealed beneath silt deposited over centuries by the rivers Selinus and Cyrene, hidden not at the bottom of the sea but underground, remarkably well preserved by the very sediment that had entombed it. The excavations that followed confirmed the essential outline of the ancient accounts. Evidence of sudden destruction, building foundations consistent with rapid abandonment and collapse, and confirmation that the site had indeed been affected by both seismic activity and inundation, likely from the tsunami ancient writers described, layered with subsequent flooding that helped seal the ruins beneath the earth for nearly 24 centuries. In this sense, mainstream archaeology has largely vindicated the ancient historians. Helike really was destroyed with terrifying speed, likely in a single catastrophic night, exactly as Strabo and Pausanias claimed. What remains far less settled is the human story buried within that geological one. Ancient accounts vary on how many people died and whether anyone survived to tell the tale directly or whether the entire population was lost, with the story surviving only through neighboring cities and second-hand report. Excavations have uncovered structures and artifacts, but the search for confirmed human remains, the physical evidence of exactly how many Helikians were caught inside their homes when the ground gave way, has been far more limited, complicated by the difficulty of excavating through waterlogged, sediment-heavy soil that has protected the site as effectively as it has concealed it. There is also the matter of Poseidon himself, or rather, what the ancient Greeks made of his role in the story. Because Helike hosted one of the most important sanctuaries to the sea god in the Greek world, ancient writers frequently framed the city's destruction as an act of divine punishment. Some accounts specifically claim the Helikians had mistreated visiting worshippers or violated the sanctuary's sacred protections, and that Poseidon's wrath followed accordingly. Modern science offers a far more grounded explanation, rooted in the well-documented seismic instability of the Gulf of Corinth region, one of the most tectonically active zones in the Mediterranean. But it is worth noting how neatly ancient religious explanation and modern geological fact ended up describing the same event from two entirely different directions. A coincidence of interpretation that still invites a certain kind of unease. Excavations at Helike continue today, slow and careful, conducted through some of the most difficult soil conditions in Greek archaeology. Each season uncovers a little more of a city that ancient writers insisted had vanished entirely, and that modern archaeology found waiting quietly beneath a lagoon all along. So the sediment keeps its secrets a little longer, releasing them only in careful, patient fragments. How many people were still inside their homes when the ground opened beneath Helike? And what else might still be resting under that quiet Achaean farmland, waiting for the next careful layer of earth to be lifted away? Northwest from the Gulf of Corinth, past the mountains of central Greece, the land rises into a remote valley in Epirus, wilder, colder, and far older in religious memory than even Helike's sanctuary to Poseidon. Here, beneath the slopes of Mount Tamaros, stood a site the Greeks considered older than Delphi itself, older perhaps than any other place where mortals believed they could speak directly to the gods and receive an answer. This was Dodona, and its oracle did not speak through a person, but through a tree. According to Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, Dodona's origins reached back to Egypt, carried there by a black dove that flew from the temple of Amun at Thebes and landed in the branches of a sacred oak, commanding a shrine be built beneath it. Whether Herodotus believed this account literally or was recording a local legend as he found it remains debated. But the core of the story, an oracle rooted in a single sacred oak tree, sacred to Zeus himself, was taken with total seriousness by the Greek world for well over 1,000 years. Unlike Delphi, where a priestess called the Pythia delivered prophecies in an apparent trance, Dodona's oracle operated through interpretation rather than possession. Priests and later priestesses known as the Pleiades, a name meaning doves, listened to the rustling of the oak's leaves in the wind, and to the sound of bronze vessels or cauldrons hung in its branches, striking one another as the breeze moved through them. From this sound, they claimed to discern the will of Zeus, translating wind and metal into answers for the pilgrims who came seeking guidance on marriage, war, health, and fortune. It should have been simple superstition, easily dismissed by history's more skeptical eye. Except that archaeology has confirmed in remarkable detail that this is not fantasy layered loosely over legend. Excavations beginning in the 19th century and continuing with far greater precision through the 20th and 21st uncovered thousands of small lead tablets at the site. Actual written questions submitted by ancient visitors to the oracle, preserved for over 2,000 years in the same soil that once held the sacred oak. These tablets are, in their way, more unsettling than any myth could be, precisely because of how ordinary and how human they are. A man asks whether his wife's child is truly his own. A woman asks which god she should pray to in order to conceive. Travelers ask about safe passage, lost property, business ventures, the fidelity of a spouse. These are not the grand mythic questions of kings and generals, though some of those exist too, but the anxious private questions of ordinary people, written down and carried to a remote oak tree in the mountains of Epirus, because they believed with total sincerity that the rustling of its leaves could answer what they could not resolve on their own. The oracle functioned for well over 1,000 years, referenced by writers from Homer onward, consulted by figures as significant as the historian Xenophon. And then, gradually, it fell silent. Not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow attrition of the ancient religious world as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and the old sanctuaries were abandoned, converted, or simply left to decay. The sacred oak itself, according to ancient accounts, was eventually cut down, reportedly during the 4th century AD under Christian authority determined to eliminate the remaining strongholds of pagan worship. Here is where the historical record, normally so carefully preserved for a site this significant, becomes strangely, almost deliberately, quiet. What became of the priests and priestesses who served there for over a millennium? Unlike Delphi, whose Pytheas and priestly structure are documented in reasonable detail across centuries of Greek and Roman writing, the specific fate of Dodona's final generation of interpreters is almost entirely absent from the historical record. We know the oracle operated for centuries. We know roughly when it was suppressed. But the people themselves, the men and women who spent their lives learning to translate wind and bronze into divine will, simply disappear from the written record sometime in late antiquity, without any account of where they went, what became of their knowledge, or whether that knowledge was ever passed on before the tradition was extinguished entirely. Some historians suggest this silence is unremarkable, an inevitable consequence of a broader, empire-wide erasure of pagan religious practice, in which countless minor traditions vanished without individual documentation, simply because no one with authority thought to record their ending. Rome was, after all, actively working to replace these traditions rather than preserve their history. But others find the completeness of the silence at Dodona specifically notable, given how thoroughly documented the site's operation was for the previous 1,000 years. A tradition that generated thousands of lead tablets, referenced repeatedly by history's most careful chroniclers, does not typically vanish from the written record so abruptly, so completely, without a single account of its final days. Excavations at Dodona continue, and new tablets are still occasionally recovered from the soil, each one another fragment of an ordinary ancient life seeking an answer from the oak. But no tablet has yet surfaced describing the sanctuary's own end. No final question asked, no final answer given, no record of what happened to the last people who claimed to speak, however imperfectly, for a god through the movement of leaves. So the mountain keeps its silence a little longer, in a valley that once held the oldest oracle in Greece. What happened to the final priests of Dodona, and where did the knowledge they carried finally go? Extinguished in a single generation, or quietly absorbed into traditions history has not yet thought to trace back to a sacred oak in Epirus. A tradition can disappear without a trace, its final practitioners erased so completely that not even their names survive. But there is another kind of disappearance altogether, one written not in absence, but in the body itself, in bones deliberately altered before burial. Sanxingdui offered one version of this, half a world and 8 centuries away. Here, in the heart of Iron Age Europe, a different set of headless dead waited to raise the same uneasy question. Not who these people prayed to, but why their bodies were sent into the earth incomplete. The site sits on the northern edge of Lake Neuchâtel, in present-day Switzerland, where a slow-moving channel once connected the lake to the surrounding marshland. Today, the area is unassuming. Reeds, still water, the quiet architecture of a landscape shaped more by drainage engineers than by history. But in 1857, unusually low water levels exposed something beneath the mud that would eventually give an entire European culture its name: La Tène, and with it, a defining chapter of what we now call the Celtic Iron Age. What emerged from that lake bed, and from subsequent excavations conducted over the following century and a half, was extraordinary. Weapons by the hundreds, swords, spearheads, shields, deliberately placed in the water rather than lost or discarded by accident. Tools, jewelry, cauldrons, wagon fittings, all deposited with evident intention into the channel over what appears to have been several centuries, roughly from the 5th to the 1st century BC. La Tène became the archaeological type site for an entire artistic and cultural tradition that spread across much of Iron Age Europe, its swirling, curvilinear metalwork style now instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with Celtic art. But among the weapons and the wagon parts, archaeologists also found human remains, and a significant number of them were missing their heads. Decapitated skeletons are not unique to La Tène itself. Similar patterns have been documented at Celtic sites across Iron Age Europe, from Britain to Gaul to the Danube Basin, enough that headhunting has become one of the more persistent and debated themes in Celtic archaeology. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, including Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, describe the Celts as a people who took the heads of defeated enemies, preserved them, reportedly sometimes in cedar oil, and displayed them as trophies, evidence of a warrior's individual prowess in battle. For a long time, these classical accounts were treated with the same caution historians apply to any description. One culture writes about another, it considers foreign, even barbaric. Were the Greeks and Romans recording genuine practice, or exaggerating for a readership that expected the peoples beyond their borders to be suitably savage? The excavated evidence complicates any simple answer. At La Tène specifically, and at related sites throughout the broader Celtic world, skulls have been recovered separately from postcranial skeletons, sometimes showing cut marks consistent with deliberate decapitation rather than natural decomposition or accidental separation. Some skulls display evidence of having been mounted, displayed, or curated after death, worn smooth in patterns suggesting handling, or modified with drilled holes that may have allowed them to be suspended or worn. This lends real physical weight to the classical writer's claims of head-taking as trophy or display. Yet not every headless burial fits neatly into a battlefield trophy narrative. Some decapitated remains at Celtic sites show no evidence of violent death at all. No cut marks on the vertebrae consistent with combat wounds. No signs the person died in the act of losing their head. This has led some archaeologists to propose an entirely different explanation running alongside the headhunting theory. ritual decapitation of the already dead, perhaps as part of funerary practice or ancestor veneration, in which a skull might be removed, kept, and honored by a community, rather than taken as a trophy of conquest from an enemy at all. And then there is La Tène's watery context specifically, which adds another layer entirely. Why deposit weapons, tools, and human remains into a channel of moving water again and again across centuries? Water held particular significance across many Iron Age European cultures, frequently associated with the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it, a threshold where offerings to gods, ancestors, or unseen forces might be most effectively delivered. Under this reading, the headless bodies at La Tène may not represent battlefield trophies at all, but something closer to sacrifice or a specific funerary rite in which certain individuals were deliberately, ceremonially separated from their heads before both body and skull were committed to the water, following a logic modern archaeology can reconstruct only partially, through pattern and inference rather than any surviving Celtic account of their own. Because that, ultimately, is the deepest obstacle at La Tène. The Celts who created these deposits left no written explanation of their own. Everything we know about their beliefs comes either from the biased pens of Greek and Roman observers who had every reason to emphasize the exotic and the savage, or from centuries of careful excavation attempting to read intention into bone, metal, and mud. Warfare, ritual, ancestor veneration, sacrifice. The evidence at La Tène can be made to support several of these explanations at once, and archaeology has not yet found a way to rule any of them out entirely. The channel at Lake Neuchâtel has been dredged, mapped, and studied for over a century and a half, yet new deposits and remains continue to surface with each careful season of work. Every skull recovered raises the same fundamental question the site has never fully answered. Were these the trophies of Celtic warriors, taken from defeated enemies and displayed as proof of victory, or the honored dead of their own communities, deliberately separated from their bodies and given to the water as an offering to something modern archaeology can only partially name? And beneath that quiet Swiss lakebed, how many more heads remain, still waiting to be pulled from the mud they've rested in for over 2,000 years? The same Celtic peoples who deposited weapons and headless remains into the waters of La Tène were not confined to the marshes of Switzerland. By the 3rd century BC, Celtic tribes had migrated and warred across much of Europe, and in 279 BC, one such force, a confederation of Gauls under a chieftain named Brennus, marched south into Greece with a singular, audacious target in mind: the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, the most revered oracle in the ancient world. They very nearly succeeded in sacking it. Ancient accounts describe the attack repelled, according to Greek writers, by a combination of Delphian defenders, harsh winter weather, and what the Greeks themselves attributed to divine intervention, Apollo defending his own sanctuary. Whether one credits the god or simply the terrain and the season, Delphi survived that assault, as it had survived, and would survive other threats across more than 1,000 years of continuous operation. But the sanctuary's long history holds mysteries considerably stranger than a single repelled invasion. Mysteries embedded in the oracle's own operation, in the deaths that occasionally accompanied it, and in a physical location whose secrets modern science only began to unravel within the last few decades. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi was considered by the ancient Greeks to be the omphalos, the navel of the world, the precise center of the earth, marked by a carved stone that visitors can still see today. Here, in the Temple of Apollo, a priestess known as the Pythia delivered prophecies that shaped the decisions of kings, generals, and city-states for over 1,000 years. Unlike the interpretive method used at Dodona, where priests read meaning into rustling leaves, the Pythia at Delphi was believed to enter direct, physical possession, inhaling something within an inner chamber of the temple that induced a trance state through which the god Apollo himself was believed to speak. For centuries, modern scholars were skeptical of ancient claims that vapors or gases played any role in this process, largely because early 20th century excavations found no geological evidence of fissures or gas-emitting rock beneath the temple. The oracle's trance was frequently explained instead as theatrical performance, or psychological suggestion, or simple fraud sustained by a priestly class with every incentive to maintain its authority. Then, beginning in the 1990s, a team of researchers, including geologist Gel de Boer and archaeologist John Hale, revisited the site with modern geological tools and reached a strikingly different conclusion. Delphi, it turned out, sits directly above the intersection of two geological fault lines, and testing of the local limestone confirmed the historical presence of hydrocarbon gases, including ethylene, capable of seeping upward through fissures in the rock, exactly as ancient writers like Plutarch, who had personally served as a priest at Delphi, had described. Ethylene, in controlled amounts, is known to produce trance-like euphoric states in humans, lending genuine scientific credibility to a phenomenon that had been dismissed as myth for the better part of a century. This discovery answered one mystery only to deepen another, considerably darker one buried in the ancient sources themselves. Because prophesying, according to several ancient accounts, was not without cost to the women who performed it. Plutarch himself recorded an incident in which a Pythia pressured into delivering a prophecy under conditions later writers considered inauspicious, possibly against unfavorable omens, possibly while unwell, reportedly died shortly after the session, her voice reduced to a horrifying, unintelligible shriek before she collapsed. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague on the precise cause, though the account is treated by Plutarch not as an isolated, freakish accident, but as evidence that the process of prophecy itself could be genuinely dangerous, even fatal, when something went wrong. When the god's vapor, or whatever animated the Pythia's trance, was met by a woman in the wrong condition to survive it. If gas exposure genuinely played a role in Delphi's prophetic trances, this account gains a chilling scientific plausibility that ancient writers themselves could not have understood in those terms. Uncontrolled exposure to hydrocarbon gases in enclosed spaces can indeed prove fatal under certain conditions, particularly to someone already vulnerable or exposed for longer than intended. Was the Pythia's reported death a genuine account of prophecy gone catastrophically wrong, an occupational hazard of communing with something the ancient world understood only as divine, but which modern science might reframe as a geological hazard imperfectly managed by priests with every incentive to keep the sanctuary operating regardless of risk? Mainstream historians remain divided on how literally to read Plutarch's account. Some treat it as a real historical incident, one of presumably several such deaths across the oracle's 1,000-year operation, most never individually recorded. Others suspect exaggeration or symbolic framing meant to illustrate the seriousness and danger inherent in approaching the divine, rather than a literal medical event. What remains genuinely unknown is how many women may have served, suffered, or died in that role across the centuries, their individual fates lost to a historical record that names only a handful of Pythias at all, out of what must have been dozens, serving across a millennium of continuous operation. Delphi's temple ruins still stand today, the fissures beneath them long since studied, sampled, and mapped by modern geologists working to confirm what ancient priests could only interpret through faith. But the human cost of that ancient interpretation, how many Pythias paid a price beyond simple service for their proximity to whatever rose from beneath that mountain, remains a question the ruins themselves cannot fully answer. So the fissures beneath Delphi continue their slow work, releasing gases that once, according to the ancients, allowed mortals to speak with a god. How many women drew that breath and never spoke again? And what other unrecorded costs did 1,000 years of prophecy quietly extract, buried now beneath the same rock that made the oracle possible in the first place? South across the Mediterranean, past the coastlines where Greek oracles once drew their power from rock and vapor, the Nile carries its own accumulated silence toward the sea. Along its banks in Upper Egypt stands a temple that has survived with a completeness almost unheard of in the ancient world. Walls still standing to their original height, ceilings still intact, inscriptions still legible after more than 2,000 years. This is the temple of Edfu, dedicated to the falcon god Horus, and it may be the most well-preserved temple in all of Egypt precisely because, for centuries, it was buried. By the time European travelers rediscovered it in the 19th century, Edfu had been swallowed almost entirely by desert sand and centuries of accumulated silt from the town built up around and over it. Villagers had constructed homes directly atop the buried temple roof, entirely unaware of what lay beneath their floors. When French archaeologist Auguste Mariette began excavating the site in the 1860s, he uncovered not a ruin, but something closer to a time capsule, a structure so completely preserved by its burial that its walls still carried some of the most extensive religious inscriptions ever found in Egypt, texts that would prove essential to modern understanding of ancient Egyptian mythology, ritual, and cosmology. Construction on the temple as it stands today began around 237 BC during the Ptolemaic period, though the site itself was considered sacred to Horus for far longer, with earlier temples believed to have stood on the same ground reaching back centuries before. It took nearly 200 years to complete, and the result is a structure covered, inside and out, with inscriptions so extensive that Egyptologists still consider Edfu one of the single richest sources of information about ancient Egyptian religious practice anywhere in the archaeological record. Among those inscriptions is a body of texts that has fascinated and unsettled researchers in equal measure. A collection of writings modern scholars refer to as the Edfu building texts, which describe the temple's supposed origins in terms that reach back far beyond any conventional timeline of Egyptian history. According to these texts, Edfu was built upon a much older primeval sacred site, one associated with a group the inscriptions call the Followers of Horus, said to have been present since a time the ancient Egyptians themselves considered impossibly remote, a foundational age preceding even their earliest dynasties, when, according to the text, the world itself was newly formed and had to be protected from chaos and flood. Mainstream Egyptology reads the Edfu texts as exactly what they appear to be within their own cultural context, a work of theological and mythological framing, common throughout ancient Egyptian temple-building tradition, in which architects and priests deliberately linked new construction to an idealized, sacred deep past in order to grant the structure legitimacy and cosmic significance. Ancient Egyptian temples were rarely presented as simply new. They were consistently framed as restorations or continuations of a mythic original, a pattern found at temple sites throughout Egypt, not unique to Edfu alone. Under this reading, the followers of Horus represent religious symbolism, not literal historical memory. A foundational myth serving a specific theological purpose, the same way many cultures root their most sacred structures in stories of divine or ancestral origin, rather than verifiable history. This is where the mainstream account largely ends. But it is also where more speculative interpretations of the Edfu texts have taken root, particularly among researchers and writers working outside conventional Egyptology, who have proposed that the primeval age and the followers of Horus described in the inscriptions might reflect something closer to a genuine, if heavily mythologized, folk memory, a garbled record of an actual much older civilization or catastrophic period that predates conventional timelines for organized Egyptian society, encoded in religious language because it was the only framework available to preserve it. These readings remain firmly outside mainstream Egyptological consensus, which points to the well-documented centuries-long tradition of similar mythic origin language across numerous Egyptian temples as sufficient explanation without requiring any lost civilization to account for it. Still, the theories persist, sustained in part by how genuinely old, layered, and cryptic the inscriptions read even to specialists who reject the more speculative conclusions drawn from them. Then there is the matter of the chambers. Edfu's remarkable preservation has not meant complete excavation. Portions of the temple complex, along with the substantial mound of debris and sand that once covered the entire structure before Mariette's excavation began, have never been fully cleared or investigated with modern archaeological techniques. Ground-penetrating surveys and partial excavations in the surrounding area have periodically suggested additional structures, foundation remains, and possible subterranean spaces connected to the temple's earlier iterations. The layers of construction and reconstruction that the Edfu texts themselves describe happening across a mythic span of ages. Egyptologists generally treat these as unremarkable extensions of a well-understood pattern of temple rebuilding, common throughout Egyptian religious sites. But full, systematic excavation of everything beneath and around Edfu has not yet been completed, and every partial survey conducted so far has left at least some portion of the site's foundation and its full building history still undocumented. Edfu stands today largely as Mariette uncovered it, its walls dense with a mythology equal parts religious devotion and, perhaps, distorted memory, describing an age its own priests believed came before recorded time. Whether that primeval age was purely symbolic, or whether it preserves some genuine echo of something older than Egyptology is prepared to countenance, remains a question the temple's remaining unexcavated ground has not yet been asked to answer. So the Falcon God's Temple keeps its oldest chapter half told, inscribed in a language of myth that resists easy translation into history. What did the followers of Horus actually represent to the priests who wrote of them? Pure theology, or a memory too old and too strange to be recorded any other way? And beneath the sand that once buried Edfu whole, how much of that older story is still waiting, undisturbed, for someone to finish digging? A century before, Edfu's priests would carve their myths of primeval ages into temple stone, and while the fissures beneath Delphi were still delivering their prophetic vapors to a trusting Greek world, a Greek explorer from the colony of Massalia set out on a voyage that should, by every measure of ancient achievement, be remembered as one of history's great feats of exploration. Instead, it survives today only as fragments, second-hand quotations, skeptical summaries, and the occasional outraged rebuttal scattered across the works of later writers who, for the most part, never read his original account at all. Because that account no longer exists. The explorer's name was Pytheas, and sometime around 325 BC, he sailed north from the Mediterranean world into waters no Greek writer had described with any real authority before him. We know remarkably little about Pytheas himself. He appears to have been a mathematician and astronomer as much as a sailor, a citizen of Massalia, modern Marseille, a bustling Greek trading colony on the southern coast of Gaul. At some point, he undertook a voyage that carried him through the Pillars of Hercules, up the Atlantic coastline of Europe, past Britain, and, according to the fragments that survive, into waters far to the north, toward a mysterious land he called Thule, 6 days' sail beyond Britain, at the very edge of the known and habitable world. Pytheas wrote an account of this journey titled, in most reconstructions, On the Ocean. And by every indication in the fragments that survive through other writers, it was extraordinary, filled with genuinely accurate astronomical and geographical observations centuries ahead of what his contemporaries could verify, or in many cases, believe. He is credited with the first reasonably accurate description of Britain's triangular shape and its coastal geography. He appears to have understood and described the connection between the moon and the tides, a genuinely sophisticated observation that later, more famous Greek and Roman writers either dismissed or failed to grasp themselves. He calculated latitude using the sun's position with a precision that impressed even skeptical later astronomers who checked his figures centuries after his death. And he described phenomena entirely outside ordinary Mediterranean experience. The near-endless daylight of high-latitude summers, a sea that seemed to thicken and slow near the edges of his journey, ice, and a land called Thule, whose precise identity, Norway, Iceland, the Shetland Islands, or somewhere else along the northern rim of Europe, scholars still debate today without full resolution. By any reasonable standard, Pytheas should be remembered alongside the great explorers of antiquity, and for a time, his account genuinely circulated. Later, Greek and Roman writers clearly had access to it, or to detailed intermediary summaries of it, because they quote and discuss it at surprising length, even centuries after Pytheas's own lifetime. But most of them did not believe him. Strabo, writing roughly 3 centuries after Pytheas's voyage, is scathing, repeatedly dismissing him as a liar and a fraud, someone who invented fantastic tales of northern lands to enhance his own reputation. Polybius, writing earlier, was similarly dismissive. The very details that modern scholars now recognize as remarkably accurate, the tidal observations, the description of pack ice, the near-perpetual summer daylight of the far north, struck many ancient Mediterranean readers as simply too strange to be credible. Descriptions of a world so unlike their own that fabrication seemed the more reasonable explanation than genuine discovery. And so, gradually, across the centuries that followed, On the Ocean was not preserved. Unlike the works of Herodotus, or Plutarch's biographies, or countless other ancient texts that survived, sometimes barely, sometimes through a single surviving manuscript copied by medieval monks. Pytheas's original account was never fully recopied through the centuries of transmission that determined which ancient texts would survive into the modern era and which would not. What we possess today is not Pytheas's voice, but the voice of his critics and his summarizers, preserved in fragments embedded within the works of Strabo, Pliny the Elder, Diodorus Siculus, and a handful of others, writers who, in many cases, appear to be quoting or criticizing earlier intermediary sources rather than Pytheas's original text directly. This is where the mainstream explanation for the loss of On the Ocean largely settles. An ordinary, if deeply unfortunate casualty of the ancient world's fragile and selective system of textual transmission, in which a work's survival depended entirely on whether successive generations of scribes considered it worth the considerable expense and labor of recopying. A text widely regarded as fantastic or unreliable by influential critics like Strabo would have had little institutional motivation behind its preservation, regardless of its actual accuracy. And Pytheas's account, describing lands and phenomena that seemed to strain credulity, was exactly the kind of text vulnerable to that particular fate. And yet, the completeness of the loss remains striking. Not a single manuscript, not even the kind of partial damaged fragment that occasionally survives for other lost ancient works, found centuries later in a monastery library or an Egyptian rubbish heap. Only quotations, filtered through the specific arguments of writers who, in most cases, were actively working to discredit Pytheas rather than preserve his observations faithfully. We are left reconstructing one of antiquity's genuinely important scientific and exploratory accounts almost entirely through the words of people who didn't believe it happened the way its own author claimed. What exactly did Pytheas see in those far northern waters that later Mediterranean readers found so difficult to credit? Modern historians and geographers have spent considerable effort trying to reverse engineer his route and identify Thule with confidence, matching his astronomical calculations and descriptions against known geography. Yet no full consensus has been reached, precisely because we are working from fragments filtered through hostile summary rather than Pytheas's own careful, original account. Somewhere in the long chain of ancient libraries, scribal decisions, and centuries of copying and recopying that determined which texts would survive antiquity and which would be allowed to disappear, On the Ocean simply stopped being copied and was lost. Whether it vanished gradually through simple neglect, or more abruptly in some specific loss we have no record of at all, remains unknown. So the northern waters Pytheas once described, the thickened sea, the endless summer light, the elusive shores of Thule, remain visible to us now only through the distorted lens of writers who came centuries later and doubted every word. What did Pytheas's own account actually say, in full, in his own voice, about the lands at the edge of the known world? And what other genuine observations, accurate and centuries ahead of their time, might have vanished into that same current of ancient disbelief, along with the manuscript that once recorded them? Not far from the waters Pytheas once sailed out of Massalia, inland from the coast in a landscape of limestone hills and scrubby Provençal countryside, a very different kind of ancient site waited to be found. Not a harbor, but a sanctuary, and not a record of exploration, but of something considerably harder to read. Just north of modern Marseille, on a rocky plateau near the village of Velo, sits a site called Roquepertuse, and what 19th and 20th century archaeologists uncovered there ranks among the most genuinely unsettling discoveries in the study of Iron Age Gaul. The site came to modern attention gradually, beginning with excavations in the 1860s and continuing more systematically into the early 20th century, revealing the remains of a sanctuary constructed by the Celto-Ligurian peoples who inhabited this region of southern Gaul before Roman conquest absorbed it into the broader Mediterranean world. Dating estimates place the sanctuary's main period of use somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BC, making it roughly contemporary with the Latine deposits found in the marshes of Switzerland, though the two sites express what may be related religious impulses in strikingly different physical forms. What archaeologists found at Roquepertuse was, in a word, architectural, and that is precisely what makes it so disturbing. This was not a battlefield, where headless remains might plausibly be explained by the ordinary brutality of combat. This was a constructed religious space, deliberately built, and its builders had incorporated human skulls directly into the structure itself. Excavators uncovered a series of carved limestone pillars, part of what appears to have been a portico or entrance structure to the sanctuary, and set into these pillars were niches, carved, purpose-built recesses, sized and shaped specifically to hold human skulls. Several skulls were recovered still in place or nearby, and forensic examination revealed something that moved this discovery from simply unusual into genuinely eerie. Some of the skulls showed evidence of having been deliberately preserved before display, including traces suggesting they had been treated in a way consistent with mummification or embalming, rather than being displayed as bare, weathered bone. Nails or pegs found associated with several skulls suggest they were affixed directly into the niches, mounted with clear intention, meant to be seen, perhaps for generations, by everyone who approached the sanctuary through its skull-lined portico. This detail alone connects Roquepertuse directly to the classical accounts of Celtic headhunting practice described by writers like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, the same ancient authors whose descriptions of head-taking as trophy and status symbol found partial corroboration in the decapitated remains at Tène. At Roquepertuse, the practice appears not merely implied by scattered bone, but architecturally formalized, built directly into a religious structure specifically designed to display human heads as a permanent, central feature of worship. But architecture answers some questions only by raising sharper ones in their place. Whose skulls were these? Were they defeated enemies, taken in battle and displayed as trophies proving the community's military strength and the individual prowess of its warriors, exactly as classical writers described? Or were they, as some archaeologists have proposed, the honored dead of the community itself, ancestors or respected figures whose skulls were deliberately preserved and displayed not as conquest, but as veneration? A physical anchor keeping a community's most significant dead permanently present within its most sacred space. The evidence at Roquepertuse does not settle this question cleanly, and it is compounded by one of the site's most striking artifacts. A carved stone sculpture found among the sanctuary's remains depicting a large bird, likely a goose or similar species, perched directly above a carved human head, its beak positioned as though pecking at or interacting with the skull below it. The imagery is difficult to interpret with confidence. Some archaeologists connect it to broader Celtic religious symbolism involving birds as psychopomps, creatures believed capable of guiding or interacting with the souls of the dead, which would support the ancestor veneration reading of the sanctuary as a whole. Others see in it a more aggressive, predatory image, potentially reinforcing the trophy display interpretation, victory made permanent in stone as well as in bone. There is also a two-faced or double-headed carved figure recovered from the site, a stone sculpture depicting what appears to be a single figure with two faces looking in opposite directions, a motif found at other Celtic and Celto-Ligurian sites across the broader region. Janus-like double-faced imagery of this kind appears across numerous ancient cultures, frequently associated with thresholds, transitions, or the ability to see simultaneously into two different realms or directions. An appropriate symbol, perhaps, for a sanctuary whose entrance was itself lined with the preserved heads of the dead, a literal threshold between the world of the living who approached it and whatever realm the sanctuary's builders believed those skulls now belonged to. Adding a further layer of uncertainty, Roquepertuse's sanctuary appears to have been deliberately destroyed at some point in the 2nd century BC, likely, though not conclusively, connected to Roman military campaigns in the region as Rome extended its control over southern Gaul in the lead-up to full conquest. Some archaeologists have proposed that this destruction was not simply collateral damage from broader warfare, but a targeted act, a deliberate dismantling of a religious site that Roman forces or their local allies specifically wished to eliminate, precisely because of what it represented to the communities who worshipped there. If true, this would suggest Roquepertuse's skull-lined portico was significant enough, threatening enough, or symbolically potent enough to warrant intentional destruction rather than simple neglect or abandonment. Though the evidence for deliberate targeting, as opposed to incidental destruction during a broader campaign, remains circumstantial rather than definitively proven. What survives today are fragments, carved pillars, skull niches, a handful of preserved skulls, sculptures whose precise meaning resists confident translation across more than 2,000 years, and a culture that left no written explanation of its own religious practice for later scholars to consult. Everything we know about why Roquepertuse looked the way it did, why its builders chose to display human heads so prominently and so permanently, comes from careful archaeological inference, rather than any surviving Celtic voice explaining the sanctuary in its own terms. So the carved niches at Roquepertuse remain fixed in their silent testimony, pillars once lined with preserved human heads, watching over a threshold whose true purpose still eludes complete understanding. Were these skulls trophies of war, proof of conquest mounted for all to see, or ancestors kept close, honored rather than defeated? And what did the sanctuary's builders believe they achieved, architecturally binding the living and the dead together so permanently, in stone meant to outlast them all? Stone meant to outlast the living. That was Roquepertuse's ambition, pillars carved to hold the dead in permanent view of the sanctuary's threshold. Some 300 miles to the north, in the river valley of the Somme, in present-day Picardy, a different Iron Age community built no pillars of stone at all. Instead, they built with bone itself, stacking the dead not to be viewed individually, but assembled, deliberately, methodically, into a structure whose scale outstrips almost anything else discovered from Celtic Gaul. The site is called Ribemont-sur-Ancre, and it sits along the Ancre River, a tributary of the Somme, in a region better known to modern history for battles fought over 2,000 years later. But long before the trenches of the First World War carved through this landscape, another kind of mass death had already left its mark here, buried and waiting for archaeologists who would not begin to fully understand what they'd found until excavations intensified in the 1980s and 1990s under researchers including Jean-Louis Bruneau. What emerged from the soil at Ribemont-sur-Ancre was a sanctuary complex dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, roughly contemporary with both Roquepertuse and the deposits at Tène, suggesting these sites were not isolated curiosities, but part of a broader, interconnected religious world spanning much of Celtic Gaul during this period. But where Roquepertuse displayed individual skulls in carved architectural niches, Ribemont-sur-Ancre presented something considerably more monumental. An ossuary structure built from the disarticulated remains of what researchers estimate to be several hundred individuals, their bones deliberately arranged, seemingly according to type. Long bones sorted together, skulls positioned separately, within a constructed timber framework that appears to have functioned as both religious monument and battlefield memorial simultaneously. The scale alone sets Ribemont apart. This was not a handful of skulls mounted at a sanctuary entrance. Archaeologists have identified remains representing what may be the largest documented assemblage of this kind from Iron Age Gaul, a structure that required the deliberate collection, processing, and architectural arrangement of hundreds of human bodies over what appears to have been a sustained period of ritual activity, rather than a single catastrophic event. Skeletal analysis has revealed something further and considerably darker, about who these individuals were and how they died. A substantial proportion of the remains show evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries sustained at or very near the time of death, consistent with violent combat. Weapons, including swords and spearheads, were found deposited alongside the human remains, deliberately damaged or killed before burial in a practice documented at other Celtic ritual sites, in which weapons were ritually destroyed, rendered unusable, before being offered to whatever gods or forces the community believed governed war and its aftermath. Taken together, the evidence strongly suggests Ribemont-sur-Ancre functioned as a battlefield sanctuary, a site where the bodies of the war dead, quite possibly defeated enemies rather than the community's own fallen, based on comparative evidence from similar sites, were systematically collected, processed, and transformed into a permanent religious monument. This interpretation aligns with, and provides remarkably direct physical support for, the accounts of Celtic warfare and ritual left by Greek and Roman observers, including the same writers, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and others, whose descriptions of headhunting and trophy display found partial confirmation at both Tène and Roquepertuse. Julius Caesar himself, writing his own account of the Gallic Wars roughly 2 centuries after Ribemont's sanctuary was constructed, described Gallic peoples dedicating the spoils of war, including captured weapons and the possessions of defeated enemies, to their gods in dedicated sacred spaces. Ribemont-sur-Ancre appears to be a physical, excavated instance of precisely this kind of practice, built at a scale that suggests the sanctuary served an entire community, or confederation of communities, over an extended period of active warfare in the region. And yet, even with this relatively coherent interpretive framework, a battlefield sanctuary, defeated enemies processed and displayed as evidence of victory, weapons ritually destroyed and dedicated to the gods of war. Ribemont-sur-Ancre still resists complete explanation. Why disarticulate the bodies so systematically, sorting bones by type rather than preserving individual burials or displaying complete skeletal remains? This level of deliberate processing suggests a ritual practice considerably more involved and time-intensive than simple battlefield disposal, implying the bodies were left to decompose for a period, then carefully collected and sorted according to a specific, structured religious logic that modern archaeology can observe in its results, but not fully reconstruct in its underlying reasoning. What did it mean to this community to separate a skull from its long bones and store each according to its own category within a purpose-built timber structure raised specifically to hold them? There is also the question of duration. The evidence suggests Ribemont-sur-Ancre was not the product of a single battle, but rather a sanctuary maintained and added to across a considerable span of time, implying sustained conflict, or perhaps a recurring ritual practice tied to the aftermath of successive campaigns, in a region whose broader Iron Age history of conflict remains only partially documented through archaeology alone, without corroborating written records from the Gallic peoples themselves. And finally, there is the matter of what happened to the sanctuary itself. Like Roquepertuse, Ribemont-sur-Ancre's period of active use appears to end sometime before the region's full absorption into Roman control, though the precise circumstances of its abandonment remain less clearly established than the deliberate destruction proposed for its counterpart to the south. Whether the sanctuary fell out of use gradually, was abandoned amid the broader disruptions of Roman conquest, or met some more specific and currently undocumented end, is a detail the archaeological record has not yet fully clarified. What remains certain is the scale of what lies beneath that stretch of the Somme Valley. Hundreds of individuals, their bodies deliberately transformed after death into the architecture of a religious monument. Evidence of warfare processed into worship through a ritual logic that operated by rules we can trace archaeologically, but cannot fully translate into their own original meaning. So the sordid bones of Ribemont-sur-Ancre remain arranged as their builders left them, categories within a structure whose full theological purpose died with the people who understood it. How many separate campaigns, how many individual battles fed this single sprawling monument to the war dead? And what did it mean to the community that built it to keep its enemies, or perhaps in some instances its own fallen, permanently present, not as memory alone, but as architecture itself. Still water, ringed by a deep volcanic crater, its surface so calm on windless mornings that it holds the surrounding hills like a mirror holds a face. This is Lake Nemi, roughly 20 miles southeast of Rome, nestled in the Alban Hills, a place the Romans themselves regarded as sacred long before anyone thought to ask what might be resting beneath its surface. For centuries, that question was answered only by legend. Local fishermen and residents of the surrounding hills told of enormous shapes glimpsed beneath the water on clear days. Vast, dark forms far too large and too regularly structured to be natural, visible only in glimpses before the light shifted or the water's surface broke and the image dissolved. Some described them as sunken ships, ancient and impossibly large. Others simply called them ghosts, hesitant to name what they thought they saw beneath a lake already wrapped in centuries of religious significance. Lake Nemi was known in antiquity as Speculum Dianae, the mirror of Diana, home to a major sanctuary dedicated to the goddess in her aspect as protector of the hunt, of wild places, and of the lake itself. The site held a particular unsettling reputation even among the Romans. Its priesthood, according to ancient writers including Strabo and Suetonius, operated under a singular and violent rule of succession. Any man wishing to become the sanctuary's priest, known as the Rex Nemorensis, the king of the grove, first had to kill his predecessor in single combat, having first proven his claim by breaking a branch from a specific sacred tree within the grove. It was a priesthood maintained not through inheritance or election, but through an unending cycle of ritual killing, a detail so strange it later inspired the title of Sir James Fraser's influential study of comparative religion and myth, The Golden Bough, published in 1890, which opens with Nemi's peculiar priesthood as its central puzzle. Against this backdrop of sacred violence and ritual killing, the persistent local legends of vast sunken shapes beneath the lake's surface took on an especially eerie quality. What could produce structures of that scale in a lake formed within a volcanic crater, in a place already steeped in stories of ritual death stretching back centuries? For a long time, mainstream scholarship treated these accounts with considerable skepticism, filing them alongside countless other bodies of water around the world associated with legendary sunken cities, ghost ships, or half-remembered catastrophes. Evocative folklore, but not history. Occasional attempts to investigate the lake produced only frustration. The water was deep, cold, and murky, and early diving technology proved inadequate to the task of confirming or dismissing what generations of local residents insisted they had glimpsed. Then, beginning in the 15th century, the legends found their first serious institutional believer. In 1446, under the direction of Cardinal Prospero Colonna, an initial attempt was made to raise whatever lay beneath Nemi's surface, using divers and grappling equipment, an effort that succeeded only in bringing up scattered fragments, bronze fittings, decorative bits of metal, tantalizing enough to confirm something substantial did indeed rest on the lakebed, but far too limited to reveal its true scale or purpose. The fragments raised more questions than they resolved, hinting at sophistication and scale without providing enough material to explain what kind of structure they had once belonged to. It would take nearly 5 centuries, and the direct intervention of Benito Mussolini's government in the late 1920s, before the full truth beneath Lake Nemi was finally confirmed. Between 1929 and 1932, Italian engineers undertook an extraordinary and unprecedented project. Draining the lake itself, lowering the water level dramatically through a system of pumps, and the reopening of an ancient Roman drainage channel, in order to fully expose whatever rested on the bottom. What emerged from the receding water confirmed that the old legends, however exaggerated in their supernatural framing, had been rooted in something entirely real. 2 enormous Roman ships dating to the reign of the Emperor Caligula in the 1st century AD lay preserved in the lakebed mud, vessels of a scale and sophistication that stunned the archaeologists and engineers who finally stood on their exposed decks after nearly 19 centuries underwater. These were not simple boats. They were floating palaces, elaborately decorated barges featuring marble flooring, sophisticated plumbing systems, heating apparatus, and bronze fittings of extraordinary craftsmanship. Vessels seemingly built not for transport or warfare, but for luxury, ceremony, and quite possibly religious purposes connected directly to the sanctuary of Diana on the lake's shore. Why had Caligula, an emperor remembered by ancient historians for extravagance bordering on madness, constructed vessels of this scale and expense on a landlocked volcanic lake, far from any practical naval or commercial purpose? Ancient sources offer little direct explanation, and the ships themselves, once fully excavated, raised as many questions as they answered. Some historians connect them to religious ceremony, possibly floating temples or platforms used in rituals honoring Diana, whose sanctuary stood prominently on Nemi's shore. Others see them as expressions of imperial excess characteristic of Caligula's reign specifically. Extravagant pleasure barges built simply because an emperor with near-limitless resources and increasingly erratic judgment decided he wanted them, sanctuary or no. The ships did not survive their rediscovery intact. Housed in a purpose-built museum on the lake's shore following their excavation, both vessels were destroyed by fire in 1944 during the chaos of the Second World War, in circumstances still debated by historians, variously attributed to retreating German forces, Allied artillery, or local looting that spiraled out of control. What survives today exists largely in photographs, detailed excavation records, and a handful of recovered fragments and replicas. A second layer of loss stacked atop the first 19 centuries the ships had already spent underwater. Lake Nemi has returned to its calm, mirror-like stillness. Its water refilled long ago, the sanctuary of Diana reduced now to scattered ruins on its shore. But the questions Caligula's ships left behind were never fully answered before fire took the physical evidence a second time. What ceremonies exactly took place aboard those floating marble decks? And how many other fragments of that story, buried deeper in the lakebed mud or lost entirely in the flames of 1944, remain forever out of reach, sunk twice, in water and then in fire, in a lake that once inspired a generation of Roman travelers to whisper about ghosts beneath its surface, only to discover the truth was strange enough on its own? The same French archaeologist whose work brought the sanctuary at Ribemont-sur-Ancre into modern understanding, Jean-Louis Bruneau, first built his reputation studying a related site roughly 60 miles to the north in the Oise Valley of Picardy, a sanctuary that predates Ribemont's construction and appears, in many ways, to represent an earlier chapter in the same broader tradition of Celtic ritual practice. This is Gournay-sur-Aronde, and its excavation, beginning in the late 1970s, would fundamentally reshape how archaeologists understood Celtic religious life in Iron Age Gaul. The site sits along the Aronde River, a tributary that winds through gently rolling farmland now largely indistinguishable from the surrounding agricultural landscape of northern France. There is little on the surface to suggest what lies beneath. No standing stones, no visible ruins, nothing to mark the ground as different from any other stretch of Picardy countryside. It was aerial photography, revealing subtle variations in soil coloration invisible from the ground, that first drew archaeologists to the site in the 1970s, hinting at buried structures that would prove, upon excavation, to be one of the most significant Celtic sanctuaries ever discovered in France. At the center of Gournay-sur-Aronde, excavators found a large rectangular enclosure, defined by a substantial ditch and earthwork boundary, dating to construction in the early 3rd century BC, making it, notably, older than both Ribemont-sur-Ancre and Roquepertuse, positioning it as something closer to an origin point for practices that would recur, in varying forms, across Celtic Gaul for the following 2 centuries. Within this enclosure, archaeologists uncovered a central pit complex that would come to define the site's significance. A series of deep shafts, methodically excavated and just as methodically filled, over an extended period of continuous ritual use. What filled these pits reads, at first, like an inventory of warfare's aftermath. Hundreds of weapons, swords, spearheads, shield fittings, recovered in a condition that immediately struck excavators as deliberate rather than incidental. Like the weapons found at Tène and Ribemont-sur-Ancre, many of the swords at Gournay showed clear evidence of intentional damage. Bent, twisted, sometimes folded entirely in half before deposition, a practice archaeologists have come to call ritual killing of the weapon itself, rendering it permanently unusable before offering it to whatever forces the sanctuary's builders believed governed the outcomes of war. But Gournay-sur-Aronde offered something the other sites had only hinted at: a documented sequence, a chronology of practice that could actually be traced through careful stratigraphic excavation. Bruno and his team were able to demonstrate that the sanctuary functioned continuously across multiple generations, with distinct phases of activity, each apparently following a battle or military campaign, during which weapons and, in some phases, human remains were brought to the site, processed, displayed for a period, likely mounted or exposed above ground, based on weathering patterns identified on some of the recovered bone, and eventually swept into the pits as the sanctuary was renewed for its next cycle of use. This pattern of exposure, followed by eventual burial, suggested something more elaborate than a single ceremonial act. It implied an entire theology of time, decay, and renewal, in which the dead, and the weapons that had killed or been carried by them, moved through distinct ritual stages, each with its own significance, before finally being committed to the earth. Human remains at Gournay, though less numerous than the weapon deposits, showed similar evidence of extended above-ground display before eventual burial, along with skeletal trauma consistent with the same patterns of violent death and probable head-taking documented at Tène and Roquepertuse. What makes Gournay particularly significant to researchers is the sheer duration of its use. Evidence suggests the sanctuary remained active for well over a century, continuously renewed and refilled across generations of the community that maintained it, only ceasing sometime after the Roman conquest of Gaul brought an end to the broader religious world that had sustained sites like this across the region. This longevity offers a rare opportunity. Rather than reading a single moment frozen in the archaeological record, researchers at Gournay can trace an evolving practice, observing how ritual behavior shifted, intensified, or changed across multiple generations of continuous religious use. And yet, for all this unusually rich chronological detail, Gournay-sur-Aronde does not fully resolve the central questions that persist across every related Celtic ritual site. Why this particular combination of weapon destruction, extended body display, and eventual pit burial? What theological logic connected the killing of a sword to the treatment of a human body, such that both underwent parallel stages of ritual processing before final deposition? Bruno himself has proposed that the practice reflects a specifically Celtic conception of warfare as fundamentally sacred, an activity inseparable from religious obligation, in which the outcomes of battle, victory, death, captured weapons, defeated enemies, belonged as much to the gods as to the surviving combatants, and had to be formally returned to them through ritual before a community could consider a conflict truly resolved. This interpretation has become highly influential in Celtic archaeology, shaping how researchers now read similar deposits at other sites across the region. But it remains, ultimately, an inference built from careful pattern recognition rather than confirmation from any surviving Celtic voice explaining the practice in its own terms. We can trace what the people who used Gournay-sur-Aronde did, methodically, across 5 or 6 generations of continuous ritual activity. We remain considerably less certain about what they believed they were accomplishing each time they filled another pit. Excavations and analysis at Gournay-sur-Aronde continue to inform Celtic archaeology today, its unusually well-preserved chronology offering a kind of Rosetta Stone for interpreting related, less thoroughly documented sites across Iron Age Gaul. But even with more evidence recovered from this single sanctuary than perhaps any comparable site in the region, the fundamental theology behind the practice remains an educated reconstruction rather than a certainty. So the pits at Gournay-sur-Aronde keep their long, layered record of weapons broken and bodies displayed above earth before finally being returned to it, generation after generation, for over a century. What debt, exactly, did this community believe it owed its gods after every battle? And how many more sanctuaries like it, quietly reshaping soil colors visible only from the air, remain undiscovered beneath the farmland of northern France, still waiting for the right photograph, taken from the right angle, to reveal what the ground below has kept hidden all along? Across the Tyrrhenian Sea from the farmland of Picardy, back to the island where this exploration first paused at Himera's mass graves, another Sicilian city carries its own buried inheritance. Not of soldiers fallen in battle, but of curses, written in lead and folded shut, meant never to be read by anyone except the gods of the underworld themselves. This is Selinus, on Sicily's southwestern coast, once among the most prosperous Greek colonies on the island, its ruins today spread across a dramatic coastal plateau dotted with the remains of temples so vast that early modern visitors mistook them for the work of giants. Founded in the 7th century BC, Selinus grew wealthy through trade and agriculture, its skyline eventually dominated by a series of monumental temples dedicated to the Greek pantheon, several of which rank among the largest religious structures ever built in the ancient Greek world. But Selinus's prosperity made it a target, positioned as it was near the boundary between Greek Sicily and the Carthaginian-controlled western portion of the island. The same geopolitical fault line that had already brought devastation to Himera not far up the coast. In 409 BC, the very same year Himera fell to the Carthaginian assault that scattered its dead into the hastily dug pits archaeologists would eventually uncover, Selinus suffered its own catastrophic destruction at Carthaginian hands. Ancient accounts, particularly from the historian Diodorus Siculus, describe a siege of brutal efficiency. The city's walls breached, its population slaughtered or enslaved in numbers that later writers cited as evidence of a uniquely merciless campaign, waged, as with Himera, at least partly framed by Carthaginian sources as long-delayed vengeance for old grievances stretching back generations. Amid the ruins of this violent history, archaeologists working at Selinus over the past 2 centuries have recovered something that offers a startlingly intimate window into the anxieties, grudges, and fears of the ordinary people who lived there before catastrophe found them. A substantial collection of curse tablets, known to scholars by the Latin term defictiones, thin sheets of lead inscribed with carefully worded appeals to the gods of the underworld, asking them to bind, silence, harm, or otherwise incapacitate a named target. The practice of writing curse tablets was not unique to Selinus. Defictiones have been recovered from sites across the ancient Mediterranean world, from Athens to Roman Britain, spanning many centuries and reflecting a religious and magical tradition that ran in parallel to, and sometimes in uneasy tension with, more conventional civic worship. But the Selinus tablets, recovered in meaningful numbers and studied intensively by classicists and epigraphers, offer a particularly rich body of evidence for understanding how this practice actually functioned among the residents of a single Greek colony in the period leading up to the city's destruction. The tablets themselves follow a recognizable formula, refined across generations of practice throughout the Greek world, though each individual example carries its own specific, often startlingly personal, grievance. A curse tablet typically named its target directly, sometimes including the target's father's name for additional specificity, ensuring the gods of the underworld could not mistake the intended victim for anyone else. The text would then invoke specific chthonic deities, gods and forces associated with death and the underworld, including figures like Hermes in his role as Psychopomp, guide of souls to the underworld, and Persephone, queen of the dead, calling upon them to bind the named individual, to silence their tongue in legal proceedings, to prevent their success in business or love, or, in the most severe examples, to bring illness, misfortune, or death upon them. What makes the Selinus tablets especially valuable to historians is the specificity of the grievances they preserve, offering a rare, unfiltered glimpse into disputes that would otherwise have left no trace in the historical record at all. Several tablets appear connected to legal proceedings, with the curse writer asking that an opposing party in a lawsuit be rendered mute or confused before a judge, unable to argue their case effectively. A form of ancient courtroom sabotage conducted entirely through ritual rather than legal argument. Others concern romantic or marital disputes, cursing a rival in love or a former partner. Still others appear rooted in business rivalries or personal feuds whose specific origins are lost to us now, preserved only in the raw anger of the curse itself, directed at named individuals who lived and breathed in Selinus over 2,000 years ago, their private conflicts accidentally immortalized in lead. This is where mainstream classical scholarship largely situates the Selinus tablets, as valuable, if unsettling, evidence of ordinary ancient religious practice, a form of private magic that operated alongside official civic religion without necessarily being sanctioned by it, born from very human impulses toward vengeance, jealousy, and the desire for control in situations, legal disputes, romantic rejection, business failure, where conventional means of resolution felt inadequate or entirely out of reach. Under this reading, the tablets are less a mystery than a mirror, reflecting emotions and social tensions that remain entirely recognizable across the intervening millennia, however foreign the ritual language used to express them. But the Selinus tablets carry a genuine mystery layered beneath this broadly understood cultural context, one rooted in the physical practice of deposition itself. Curse tablets across the Greek and later Roman world were typically not left in the open. They were folded, sometimes pierced with a nail, an act some scholars interpret as symbolically binding the curse's power, fixing it in place, quite literally nailing the victim's fate to the underworld, and then buried or deposited in locations believed to hold particular ritual significance. Graves, especially those of individuals who had died young or violently, whose restless or unsettled spirits were thought more likely to carry a curse effectively to the underworld gods. Wells and springs, understood as points of access to chthonic realms, or sanctuaries specifically associated with underworld deities. Why these specific locations, and what did the choice of deposition site signify about the curse writer's specific intentions? Some tablets found at Selinus appear to have been placed in graves of individuals seemingly unrelated to either the curse writer or their target. Anonymous burials pressed into service as a kind of ritual mailbox, their occupants recruited posthumously, without consent naturally, into carrying a stranger's grievance into the afterlife. This detail unsettles even scholars accustomed to the broader practice, raising uncomfortable questions about whose graves were considered appropriate for this purpose, and whether local communities held specific, perhaps unwritten understandings about certain burials being available, in a sense, for this kind of ritual repurposing. There is also the question of authorship and literacy embedded within the tablets themselves. Curse tablets required a certain level of ritual knowledge, correct invocations, appropriate formulaic language, knowledge of which deities to address and how. That suggests either the curse writers themselves possess specialized training, or, as many scholars believe more likely, a class of ritual specialists existed within Selinus and comparable cities, professional curse writers who could be hired to compose an effective defixio on behalf of a client seeking vengeance or protection. If such specialists existed, as seems probable, they left remarkably little independent trace of themselves in the historical record beyond the tablets they may have helped produce anonymously for others. A hidden profession, practiced at the margins of accepted civic religion, whose practitioners remain almost entirely unknown to us by name. The destruction of Selinus in 409 BC adds a final, haunting layer to this already unsettling body of evidence. Many of the individuals named in these cursed tablets, plaintiffs, rivals, lovers, business partners, and the unknown targets of their anger, would have still been alive, or only recently dead, when Carthaginian forces breached the city's walls and ended Selinus as a functioning Greek settlement. Did any of these carefully worded grievances anticipate what was coming, in even the smallest way? Did the catastrophic violence that swept through the city in its final days render decades of private legal disputes, romantic betrayals, and business rivalries suddenly, brutally irrelevant, the curses left unresolved and unanswered, their intended victims and their curse writers alike caught in a destruction that made no distinction between the cursed and the cursing. Archaeological work at Selinus continues today, and additional tablets occasionally surface during ongoing excavation of the site's extensive ruins. Each one a small private window into a specific human grievance that its author fully expected to remain hidden forever, addressed only to gods believed capable of reading, led, buried in darkness. Modern scholars, translating and cataloging these texts, have become the unintended recipients of messages never meant for any living audience at all. So the folded lead sheets of Selinus continue to surface from ground that also holds the memory of the city's violent end, private curses outlasting both the people who wrote them and the world in which those grievances once seemed to matter enough to justify appealing directly to the gods of the dead. What became of the individuals named in these tablets? Did any curse find its mark before Carthage's arrival made the question meaningless? And how many more grievances, nailed shut in lead and buried in strangers' graves, remain scattered somewhere beneath Selinus's temples, waiting for the next excavation to give voice, however briefly, to an anger its author believed only the underworld would ever hear? Words never meant for living eyes, sealed away in darkness and addressed only to gods who dwell below. That same impulse, to write for the dead and bury the message deep, echoes further along the North African coast, though what waits there was carved not into lead, but into the living rock itself, across chambers that stretch for miles beneath a city that has been called by those who study it one of the great lost metropolises of the ancient Greek world. This is Cyrene, in present-day Libya, founded around 631 BC by Greek colonists from the island of Thera, according to the account preserved by Herodotus. It grew over the following centuries into one of the wealthiest and most culturally significant Greek cities outside the Greek mainland itself, renowned throughout antiquity for its philosophers, its medical scholars, and a rare, highly prized plant called silphium, whose cultivation made Cyrene fantastically wealthy before the plant itself, over-harvested for centuries, apparently vanished from history entirely sometime in antiquity. Its exact botanical identity still debated by modern researchers, another small mystery embedded within a much larger one. But it is not silphium, nor the city's above-ground ruins, extensive as they are, including a well-preserved temple of Apollo and a Greek theater carved directly into the hillside, that occupies the deepest layer of Cyrene's unresolved history. It is what lies beneath the city, carved into the soft limestone bedrock across a necropolis of genuinely staggering scale, a network of tombs, chambers, and interconnected passages that archaeologists estimate may include tens of thousands of individual burial spaces, spreading across the hills surrounding the ancient city center, many still only partially mapped even today. Cyrene's necropolis developed gradually across more than 1,000 years of continuous use, from the city's founding in the 7th century BC through the Hellenistic period, Roman annexation, and well into late antiquity, making it one of the longest continuously used burial grounds anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Unlike more contained, single-period cemeteries found at many ancient sites, Cyrene's necropolis represents an accumulated layered record of successive generations, each adding their own chambers, facades, and burial customs to a landscape that had already been used by their ancestors for centuries before them. Many of the tombs are carved directly into the rock face in elaborate architectural forms, their exteriors shaped to resemble temple facades, complete with carved columns, pediments, and decorative elements. Architecture meant not for the living to inhabit, but purely for the presentation of the dead, a permanent stone theater of family status and memory carved into a hillside that would have been visible from considerable distances across the surrounding landscape. Interior chambers frequently contain multiple burial niches, suggesting extended family use across generations, along with painted decoration in some of the better preserved examples, offering rare glimpses of ancient funerary artwork that has survived far better underground than comparable painted decoration exposed to open air elsewhere in the Greek world. The sheer scale of the necropolis alone has made complete excavation and documentation a genuinely daunting undertaking, one that has occupied archaeologists intermittently since the 19th century without ever reaching full completion. Italian archaeologists conducted significant excavation and study during the colonial period in the early 20th century, followed by continued work from various international teams across subsequent decades. But political instability in Libya over recent decades, including periods of significant conflict, has repeatedly interrupted sustained archaeological work at the site, leaving substantial portions of the necropolis's tens of thousands of chambers still unmapped, unexcavated, or only partially documented, their contents and inscriptions unrecorded by modern scholarship. This incomplete state of documentation is where Cyrene's necropolis shifts from simply impressive to genuinely mysterious. Because within the portions that have been studied, researchers have recovered evidence of burial practices and inscriptions that raise questions extending well beyond simple funerary record-keeping. Some tombs contain inscriptions referencing specific religious or philosophical beliefs about the afterlife that align with what we know of broader Greek funerary religion, invoking figures like Persephone and Hermes in roles similar to those found in the cursed tablets of Selinus and other Greek sites, guiding the dead toward whatever existence awaited them beyond the grave. But Cyrene also developed its own distinct religious character over the centuries, shaped by its particular geographic position at the edge of the Greek world, in close proximity to Egyptian and Libyan cultural influences that filtered into the city's religious practice in ways not always fully documented in surviving literary sources. Some tomb inscriptions and associated artifacts suggest syncretic religious practices, blending conventional Greek funerary custom with elements that appear to reflect local Libyan tradition or Egyptian influence, a hybridization that makes definitive interpretation of some burial practices considerably more complicated than at sites drawing from a more singular cultural tradition. Compounding this interpretive difficulty is the sheer physical unpredictability of the necropolis itself. Because the tombs were carved gradually over centuries, often expanding earlier chambers or connecting previously separate burial spaces as later generations extended existing family plots, the underground network has produced, and continues to produce, genuine surprises even for researchers with extensive experience at the site. Passages open unexpectedly into previously unknown chambers. Sealed niches, undisturbed since antiquity, are occasionally rediscovered containing grave goods or remains that had escaped both ancient looting and centuries of subsequent archaeological attention. The scale and complexity of the site means that even after roughly 2 centuries of intermittent study, archaeologists cannot claim with confidence that they have identified the full extent of what the necropolis actually contains. This uncertainty has inevitably invited more speculative interpretation at the margins of mainstream scholarship. Some researchers and writers working outside conventional Libyan archaeology have proposed that portions of the necropolis, particularly its less accessible or unmapped sections, may connect to natural cave systems or additional constructed passages extending well beyond the currently documented burial chambers. Networks potentially linking to other, still unidentified areas of ancient Cyrene, or even to the surrounding landscape in ways not yet confirmed through systematic survey. Mainstream archaeologists generally treat these proposals with considerable caution, noting that the region's geology does include natural karst cave formations that could plausibly account for reported irregular passages without requiring any additional intentional construction beyond what has already been documented. But the honest position of the field remains that a definitive, complete map of Cyrene's full necropolis simply does not yet exist, leaving genuine, unresolved uncertainty about the site's true total extent, a rare admission in a discipline that generally prefers precise, confirmed boundaries to open possibility. There is also the matter of what continued instability in the region has meant for the site's ongoing preservation and study. Periods of conflict in Libya over the past several decades have not only interrupted formal excavation, but have also left portions of the necropolis vulnerable to looting, undocumented digging, and deterioration, meaning that some fraction of whatever remains undiscovered within those tens of thousands of chambers may be lost to careful archaeological record before any systematic study ever reaches it. Inscriptions read once, if at all, by looters rather than scholars, then lost again, this time perhaps permanently, to the same darkness that had preserved them for over 2,000 years. Cyrene's above-ground ruins remain a UNESCO World Heritage Site, their temples and theater drawing renewed scholarly attention whenever regional stability allows sustained work to resume. But it is the necropolis, spreading unseen beneath the hills surrounding the ancient city, that continues to hold the site's deepest unresolved questions. Tens of thousands of chambers, carved and used across more than a millennium, only a portion of which any modern researcher has ever actually entered. So the tombs of Cyrene keep their long silence, chamber after chamber carved into hillside limestone by generation after generation of a city whose full underground extent has never been completely charted. How many of those tens of thousands of burial spaces remain entirely unopened since the moment their final occupant was sealed inside? And somewhere within that unmapped darkness, connecting family to family, century to century, what inscriptions, what grave goods, what final unread messages to the dead are still waiting, patiently, for someone to finally find their way back in? North across the Mediterranean, away from the unmapped tombs of Libya, the landscape changes entirely. From limestone hillside riddled with chambers to a quiet plain in northern Greece, in the region once called Macedonia, where in 1977, a Greek archaeologist named Manolis Andronikos began digging beneath an unassuming earthen mound near the modern village of Vergina, convinced it concealed something considerably more significant than local tradition had ever credited it with. He was right. What Andronikos found beneath that mound would become one of the most consequential archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and one whose central identification remains, even now, a subject of genuine scholarly dispute. Vergina had long been suspected, on linguistic and geographic grounds, to occupy the site of ancient Aigai, the original royal capital of the Macedonian kingdom, before Philip II moved his court to Pella. Ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus, identified Aigai as the traditional burial ground of Macedonian royalty, the place where kings of the ruling Argead dynasty were laid to rest regardless of where they had governed or died. If Vergina truly was Aigai, the mound Andronikos targeted for excavation held the tantalizing possibility of undisturbed royal tombs, a prospect virtually unheard of in a region so thoroughly picked over by centuries of looting, war, and earlier, less careful excavation. Beneath the mound, Andronikos found not one tomb, but several, remarkably, largely intact, spared the looting that had claimed nearly every other significant Macedonian royal burial site over the preceding 2 millennia. The most significant of these, designated Tomb 2, contained a 2-chambered structure sealed behind a stone door, its main chamber holding a marble sarcophagus within which sat a solid gold larnax, a chest containing cremated human bones wrapped in purple cloth, along with a magnificent gold wreath of oak leaves and acorns, weapons, armor, and other grave goods of unmistakably royal quality. A smaller antechamber held a second larnax, this one containing the cremated remains of a woman, alongside her own set of elaborate grave goods, including gold and ivory items of similarly royal quality. The question that Andronikos' discovery immediately raised, and that has occupied Macedonian scholarship ever since, was as simple to ask as it has proven difficult to definitively answer. Whose bones were these? The timing and quality of the tomb pointed toward the highest levels of Macedonian royalty during a period of extraordinary historical significance. Andronikos himself proposed, based on architectural style, the tomb's location and associated artifacts, that Tomb Dasanin belonged to Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, assassinated in 336 BC, under circumstances that were themselves never fully resolved by ancient sources. Struck down by one of his own bodyguards at his daughter's wedding celebration, the assassin's motives debated by ancient historians and never conclusively established even in antiquity. If Andronikos' identification was correct, this meant archaeologists had found the actual remains of the man who built the military and political foundation his son Alexander would use to conquer the known world, a discovery of almost unparalleled historical significance. For years, this identification was widely, though not universally, accepted. But beginning in the 1980s and continuing with particular intensity into the following decades, a competing hypothesis gained increasing scholarly traction. That tomb too did not belong to Philip II at all, but to Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander the Great's half-brother, who inherited a nominal, largely powerless kingship in the chaotic power struggles that erupted among Alexander's generals immediately following his death in Babylon, the same death whose unresolved circumstances opened an earlier chapter of this very investigation. Philip III Aridaeus, historical sources suggest, was intellectually disabled and served largely as a figurehead manipulated by more powerful generals during the fractured early years of the Wars of the Successors, before ultimately being executed in 317 BC on the orders of Alexander's mother Olympias amid the ongoing violence of that succession crisis. Both identifications rest on genuinely substantial competing bodies of evidence, and the debate has, at times, grown remarkably contentious within Greek and international archaeology. Proponents of the Philip II identification point to skeletal evidence, including analysis of the male skeleton's leg bones showing signs consistent with a serious battle injury, a detail some researchers have connected directly to ancient historical accounts describing a severe leg wound Philip II sustained during a military campaign years before his assassination. Forensic facial reconstruction work conducted on the skull in the 1980s produced a face that some researchers argued bore a plausible resemblance to ancient artistic depictions of Philip II, lending further support to the original identification. But researchers favoring the Philip III Aridaeus identification have raised persistent counter-arguments, particularly around the tomb's precise dating based on architectural style and associated grave goods, which some specialists argue align more closely with the specific period of Aridaeus's brief reign and death in 317 BC than with Philip II's assassination 2 decades earlier in 336 BC. Additional skeletal and archaeological analysis, including studies published in the 2000s and 2010s using increasingly sophisticated forensic and isotopic techniques, has continued to produce genuinely conflicting conclusions, with different research teams examining substantially the same physical evidence, arriving at confidently opposing identifications published in respected academic journals. The identity of the woman buried alongside the man in Tomb 2's antechamber compounds the uncertainty rather than resolving it. If the tomb belongs to Philip II, the female remains are most plausibly identified with one of his several wives, with scholarly opinion divided among candidates including Cleopatra Eurydice, his final wife, whose own fate following Philip's assassination is itself murky and disputed in ancient sources. If instead the tomb belongs to Philip III Aridaeus, the female remains would most likely belong to his wife, Eurydice II, who was, according to ancient accounts, forced to take her own life alongside her husband's execution, both victims of the same brutal succession crisis that consumed so many of Alexander's surviving relatives in the years following his death. Adjacent tombs at the Vergina site have generated their own overlapping questions. Tomb Psi, though looted in antiquity, contained skeletal remains that some researchers have proposed might belong to Philip II after all, along with other members of the royal family, complicating rather than simplifying the broader puzzle of which tomb belongs to which historical figure. Tomb III, meanwhile, is more broadly, though still not entirely without dispute, associated with Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great and Roxana, murdered as a teenager around 309 BC amid the same relentless dynastic violence that consumed nearly every direct claimant to Alexander's throne in the chaotic decades following his death at Babylon. What makes the Vergina tombs particularly significant, beyond the specific identity debate, is what they reveal collectively about the sheer scale of violence that consumed the Macedonian royal family in the years surrounding Alexander's death and its aftermath. Nearly every candidate proposed for these tombs, Philip II's, Philip III Aridaeus, Eurydice II, Alexander IV, died through assassination, forced suicide, or execution, victims of a multi-generational succession crisis that eliminated the Argead dynasty's claimants with a thoroughness bordering on systematic extermination, carried out largely by the very generals who had once served Alexander directly. Modern analytical techniques continue to be applied to the Vergina remains, and the identification debate, rather than settling with time, has, if anything, become more technically sophisticated and more genuinely contested as successive research teams apply new forensic, isotopic, and osteological methods to evidence first excavated nearly 5 decades ago. No definitive academic consensus has yet emerged capable of ending the dispute entirely, leaving open the striking possibility that we may already possess the actual remains of Alexander the Great's father, or alternatively, his troubled half-brother, without being able to say with complete certainty which. So the gold larnax recovered from beneath that quiet Macedonian mound continues to hold its cremated secret. Wrapped now in purple cloth long since faded, its owner's true identity argued over by scholars working from the same bones, the same grave goods, the same tomb, yet reaching genuinely opposing conclusions. Whose remains actually rest within that sarcophagus? The father who built an empire's foundation, or the half-brother who briefly, powerlessly, inherited its ruins? And what would it mean after nearly half a century of study if archaeology were finally forced to admit that some questions asked of the dead may simply have no answer waiting to be found? The armies that carried Alexander's ambitions as far as India did not simply vanish when their king died in Babylon. They left behind garrisons, administrators, and entire transplanted communities of Greeks and Macedonians scattered across the easternmost reaches of the empire he had assembled. Settlements meant to anchor Hellenistic rule in territories further from the Aegean than any Greek city had ever stood before. One of these settlements, at the far edge of what Alexander's successors would carve into the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, sat at the confluence of 2 rivers in what is now northern Afghanistan. Today, we call it Khanoum, though we do not actually know what its own inhabitants called it, and its abandonment, sometime in the 2nd century BC, remains one of the more genuinely puzzling disappearances in the entire Hellenistic world. The site sits at the meeting point of the Amudarya and Kokcha rivers, a strategic position that made it a natural center for trade and administration in ancient Bactria, a region that occupied a crucial crossroads between the Mediterranean world, Persia, India, and the steppes of Central Asia. French archaeologists, working under the Délégation archéologique française on Afghanistan, began serious excavation of the site in the 1960s, following its identification a few years earlier, and what they uncovered across more than a decade of work astonished specialists in Hellenistic archaeology. A fully realized Greek city, complete with a theater, a gymnasium, a Greek-style administrative palace complex, an inscribed philosophical text quoting Delphic maxims, and religious structures blending Greek architectural forms with elements distinctly foreign to the traditional Greek world. A genuine Hellenistic city functioning at what felt, to researchers, like an almost impossibly distant frontier. Khanoum's very existence confirmed something historians had suspected from scattered literary references, but had never been able to substantiate archaeologically in such vivid, complete detail. That the Greek cultural world established by Alexander's conquests had not simply faded at its eastern edges into vague garrison outposts, but had produced genuine, functioning Greek cities, thousands of miles from the Aegean, maintaining Greek civic institutions, Greek education, Greek religious practice, and Greek artistic sensibility for generations after Alexander's death, in a region that would otherwise be known to us almost entirely through Persian, Indian, and later Central Asian sources, with little Greek perspective preserved at all. Founded most likely in the late 4th or early 3rd century BC, in the decades immediately following Alexander's death and the chaotic wars of succession that consumed his generals, the same conflicts that filled the tombs at Vergina with murdered kings and forced suicide queens. Khanoum grew over roughly 2 centuries into a substantial urban center, its population likely a genuine mixture of transplanted Greek and Macedonian settlers, their descendants, and local Bactrian populations integrated into the city's economic and possibly civic life. To a degree, modern scholars continue to debate based on the archaeological evidence recovered. The city's excavated remains reveal a level of investment and permanence that argues strongly against any assumption that its Greek inhabitants regarded Bactria as a temporary posting. The theater alone, one of the easternmost Greek theaters ever discovered, could reportedly seat several thousand spectators. The gymnasium, a central institution of Greek civic and educational life, functioned as it would have in any city within the Greek heartland, training young citizens in athletics and, presumably, the broader cultural education that Greek gymnasium culture traditionally provided. Inscriptions recovered from the site, including philosophical maxims explicitly attributed to the sanctuary at Delphi, demonstrate that this remote frontier city maintained genuine, active intellectual and religious connections to the broader Greek cultural world, rather than existing as some isolated, culturally attenuated outpost, slowly forgetting its origins. And then, sometime in the 2nd century BC, Khanoum was abandoned and largely destroyed. This is where the mainstream historical narrative, while broadly coherent, still leaves genuine gaps that archaeology alone has not been able to fully close. The most widely accepted explanation connects Khanoum's fall to the broader collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom under pressure from nomadic incursions sweeping down from Central Asia during this period. Various steppe peoples, referenced in fragmentary Chinese and Greek sources under names including the Yeji, whose migrations and invasions across the 2nd century BC are understood to have overwhelmed and eventually dismantled Greco-Bactrian political control across much of the region. Under this reading, Khanoum's destruction represents one casualty among several within a broader pattern of Hellenistic collapse in Central Asia, as centuries of Greek rule in Bactria finally gave way to new political powers arriving from the steppes. Archaeological evidence at the site does show signs consistent with violent destruction, evidence of fire, and a level of sudden, catastrophic disruption to the city's final phase of occupation that argues against a purely gradual, voluntary abandonment. This aligns reasonably well with the nomadic invasion narrative, and most specialists in Hellenistic Central Asian history accept some version of this explanation as the essential cause of the city's end. But the specifics remain frustratingly incomplete. Which specific group or groups were directly responsible for the city's final destruction is not established with the same confidence as the broader pattern of regional collapse. The fragmentary written sources describing nomadic movements into Bactria during this period do not name Khanoum specifically, leaving archaeologists to infer the connection from timing and circumstantial evidence rather than direct textual confirmation. The precise sequence of events in the city's final years, whether it fell in a single decisive assault or endured a more prolonged period of decline, disruption, and partial abandonment before a final destructive event, remains debated among specialists working from a site whose full excavation was itself dramatically interrupted. That interruption forms its own layer of loss stacked atop the ancient mystery. Ongoing conflict in Afghanistan beginning in the late 1970s forced French archaeological teams to abandon further systematic excavation of Khanoum, and the site has suffered extensively from looting in the decades since, as decades of war and instability in the region left it largely unprotected. Portions of the site that might have offered crucial additional evidence about its final years and ultimate destruction have likely been lost entirely to unauthorized digging, their artifacts and stratigraphic context destroyed before any scholar could properly document them. A modern loss layered directly on top of an ancient one, further narrowing the window through which historians can examine exactly how this remarkable Greek city met its end. There is also the deeper, more speculative question of what became of Khanoum's population after the city's destruction, assuming a substantial number of its Greek, Macedonian, and mixed heritage residents survived whatever catastrophic event ended organized life at the site. Did they disperse into surrounding Bactrian communities, gradually losing distinct Greek cultural identity across subsequent generations? Did some portion migrate further, perhaps toward other, better documented centers of Hellenistic culture that persisted longer elsewhere in the region? Scholars have proposed connections between Khanoum's population and the broader Greco-Bactrian and later Indo-Greek cultural sphere that continued to exist, in diminished and evolving form, for generations after Khanoum itself fell silent. but no clear documented lineage traces the city's specific former residents forward into these later successor cultures with any real confidence. What Khanoum leaves behind, then, is a strange kind of double disappearance. An ancient Greek city on the far eastern frontier of the Hellenistic world, destroyed under circumstances historians can sketch only in broad outline rather than precise detail, followed nearly 2,000 years later by a second, modern disappearance, as war and looting closed off further access to whatever additional answers the site's unexcavated portions might once have offered. The rivers that once made this confluence such a strategic and prosperous location continue their course today. Past ruins that briefly, remarkably, hosted a full expression of Greek civic life at what must have felt, to the people who built it, like the very edge of the known world. Who exactly brought that city to its final, fiery end? And did any of its residents watching that destruction unfold understand it as the closing of an era that had already lasted longer than anyone might reasonably have expected, so far from home, and scattered now across a landscape still recovering from its own long era of conflict? How much of Khanoum's true final chapter has already been lost twice over, once to whatever force ended it in antiquity, and again to a modern history that gave looters more time with the site than it ever gave its own archaeologists? Roughly a century before nomadic horsemen swept down from the steppes to end Khanoum's long experiment in Eastern Hellenism, a very different group of migrants had already carved out their own unlikely foothold within the Greek world. Not arriving from the east but from the north and west, crossing into Asia Minor from Europe and settling, permanently and disruptively, in the heart of what had once been purely Greek and Anatolian territory. These were the Galatians, and the fate of the wealth they accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of independent rule remains one of the more tantalizing open questions in the archaeology of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Galatians were, by origin, Celtic peoples, kinsmen, culturally and linguistically, to the same Gallic tribes whose ritual sanctuaries at Gournay-sur-Aronde, Tène, and Ribemont-sur-Ancre have already surfaced earlier in this investigation. Beginning around 279 BC, the very same invasion that saw the chieftain Brennus march on Delphi itself. Waves of Celtic migration and military campaigning pushed steadily eastward through the Balkans and across the Hellespont into Anatolia, where these particular Celtic groups eventually settled permanently in the central plateau of what is now Turkey, establishing a distinct territory that ancient writers came to call Galatia. For nearly 2 centuries, the Galatians maintained a genuinely independent kingdom in the middle of Hellenistic Asia Minor, a Celtic political and cultural enclave surrounded by, and in constant negotiation and conflict with, the Greek successor kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander's fractured empire. Ancient sources, including later Roman writers, describe the Galatians as formidable warriors, frequently employed as mercenaries by neighboring Hellenistic powers, and equally frequently raiding and extracting tribute from the same Greek cities they were sometimes hired to defend. A reputation for both martial skill and predatory opportunism that made them simultaneously valuable allies and genuinely feared neighbors throughout the region. This combination of mercenary income, tribute extraction, and periodic outright raiding across a territory spanning nearly 2 centuries of independent operation implies the accumulation of substantial wealth within Galatian hands. Gold, silver, and other valuables flowing into Galatian territory through payment, plunder, and negotiated tribute from Greek cities eager to avoid the alternative. Ancient sources occasionally reference this wealth directly. The historian Livy, among others, describes Roman forces campaigning against the Galatians in the early 2nd century BC, specifically anticipating substantial plunder from Galatian territory, suggesting that by this period, Galatian material wealth was widely recognized and considered a legitimate strategic objective by the major powers eventually drawn into conflict with them. The kingdom's independence effectively ended following a series of Roman military campaigns, most significantly a decisive Roman victory in 189 BC that broke Galatian military power and brought the region increasingly under Roman influence, though a nominally independent client kingdom status persisted for some time afterward before eventual full incorporation into the Roman provincial system. This transition, from independent Celtic kingdom to Roman client state to eventual full provincial absorption, spanned roughly another century and a half, culminating in the region's formal annexation as a Roman province in 25 BC. Here is where the mystery genuinely begins, because the substantial wealth that ancient sources clearly indicate the Galatians accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of independent operation has left remarkably little confirmed archaeological trace. This absence is not simply due to lack of searching. Modern Turkey has produced spectacular archaeological finds from numerous other ancient cultures and periods across its territory, and Galatia's approximate territorial boundaries in the central Anatolian plateau are reasonably well understood from both ancient written sources and subsequent archaeological survey. Yet compared to the wealth implied by ancient textual references, and compared to the kind of rich material record found at comparable sites associated with other successful ancient warrior aristocracies, confirmed Galatian royal treasure, significant hoards of gold and silver clearly attributable to the kingdom's ruling elite, remained strikingly sparse in the archaeological record. Several explanations, none mutually exclusive and none fully satisfying on their own, have been proposed by historians and archaeologists working on this question. The most straightforward suggests simple archaeological bad luck, an accident of preservation and discovery rather than genuine absence. Galatian sites may simply not have been excavated as extensively or as fortunately as comparable locations elsewhere, and significant finds may yet await discovery beneath central Anatolian soil that has not received the same intensity of archaeological attention as more famous regions of the ancient Mediterranean world. Under this reading, the missing treasure is not truly missing at all, merely not yet found, a matter of future excavation rather than any genuine historical mystery requiring more elaborate explanation. A second explanation points to the specific, well-documented Roman campaigns against Galatia, particularly the decisive 189 BC victory led by the Roman consul Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, whose campaign ancient sources explicitly describe as extraordinarily profitable, with enormous quantities of plunder extracted from Galatian territory and eventually paraded through Rome itself. Livy's account of Vulso's triumph describes vast quantities of gold and silver displayed in the traditional Roman triumphal procession, sourced explicitly from the defeated Galatians. Under this explanation, the missing Galatian treasure is not missing so much as thoroughly redistributed, melted down, minted into Roman coinage, absorbed into the broader Roman economic and material culture in ways that make its specific Galatian origin untraceable in the archaeological record today, its gold surviving perhaps in transformed, unrecognizable form within Roman material culture broadly, rather than as any discrete, identifiable hoard still waiting somewhere to be rediscovered. This explanation carries genuine historical weight, supported directly by Livy's own description of Vulso's campaign and its documented plunder. But it does not fully account for the absence of earlier material evidence either. Burial goods, votive deposits, or other forms of accumulated wealth that a genuinely prosperous warrior aristocracy operating for nearly 2 centuries might reasonably be expected to have produced and deposited across multiple generations, independent of whatever the Romans specifically extracted during their later military campaigns. Galatian elite burials, where identified and excavated, have generally not produced grave goods on a scale that fully matches the wealth implied by ancient textual sources describing the kingdom's broader economic activity and its documented capacity to extract substantial tribute and plunder from its Greek neighbors over multiple generations. This gap between textual implication and archaeological confirmation has left genuine room for more speculative proposals at the margins of mainstream scholarship, including suggestions that additional, still undiscovered Galatian hoards may exist, deliberately concealed either in anticipation of Roman conquest or during the gradual multi-generational process of the kingdom's absorption into the Roman provincial system. Wealth hidden by a ruling elite unwilling to see it seized by an advancing imperial power, buried with intentions of later recovery that never came to pass, whether through death, displacement, or simply the slow erosion of Galatian political autonomy across the century and a half separating military defeat from full provincial annexation. Mainstream archaeologists generally treat such proposals with appropriate caution, noting the genuinely limited direct evidence supporting deliberate concealment specifically, as opposed to the more straightforward explanations of incomplete excavation or Roman redistribution already available. But the underlying gap those speculative theories are attempting to explain, the mismatch between what ancient texts describe and what modern archaeology has actually recovered, remains real, and, so far, not fully resolved by any single explanation currently available to historians. Central Anatolia continues to yield archaeological discoveries as survey and excavation work proceeds, gradually filling in a regional picture that remains considerably less complete than for many other areas of comparable historical significance in the ancient Mediterranean world. Whether future excavation will eventually locate the kind of substantial, clearly attributable Galatian royal treasure that ancient textual sources seem to imply once existed, or whether Vulso's triumph in 189 BC and subsequent Roman absorption genuinely account for the wealth's complete disappearance into the broader currents of Roman material culture, remains an open question that the current archaeological record has not yet definitively answered in either direction. So the Anatolian plateau that once hosted nearly 2 centuries of independent Celtic rule keeps whatever remains of that accumulated wealth largely to itself, whether scattered still beneath unexcavated ground or transformed long ago into coinage that paraded once through the streets of Rome before dispersing entirely beyond any hope of modern tracing. Did the gold that Livy describes flowing into Galatian hands across generations of tribute and plunder simply vanish into the Roman economy, indistinguishable now from any other ancient silver or gold in circulation? Or does some portion of it remain, deliberately hidden by a kingdom that saw its independence ending and chose concealment over surrender, still waiting somewhere beneath the same plateau where Celtic warriors once built a kingdom few historians, even now, feel they fully understand? Wealth hidden by people who saw their world ending and chose concealment over surrender. That same impulse, buried treasure entrusted to the earth by a community anticipating its own dissolution, surfaces again in the soft limestone hills of the Judean lowlands, though what waits there beneath the ground took a very different form than gold, and the questions it raises cut considerably closer to the private human anxieties of the people who dug it. The site is called Maresha, or Tel Maresha, situated in the Shephelah region of modern Israel, a landscape of gently rolling hills composed of soft, easily workable chalk bedrock that ancient inhabitants discovered could be carved with relative ease into extensive underground complexes. Maresha itself appears in the Hebrew Bible as an Israelite city dating back to the Iron Age, but the site's most extraordinary archaeological features date to a later period, when the city flourished as a prosperous cosmopolitan center under Hellenistic rule, populated by a genuinely mixed community of Idumeans, Sidonians, and Greeks living alongside one another in the centuries following Alexander's conquests reshaped the political map of the eastern Mediterranean. Beneath the visible above-ground ruins of Maresha lies an extensive network of subterranean chambers, cut directly into the soft local chalk. Cisterns, olive presses, columbaria for raising doves, storage complexes, and, most significantly for the questions this site continues to raise, burial caves containing some of the most elaborately decorated tomb paintings recovered anywhere from the Hellenistic period Near East. The most famous of these, discovered in the 19th century and known to archaeologists as the Sidonian tomb, contains a painted frieze running along its walls depicting an extraordinary procession of animals: lions, leopards, an elephant, a giraffe, and various other creatures rendered with genuine artistic skill, alongside Greek inscriptions identifying the tomb as belonging to a specific Sidonian family, complete with names and, in several cases, ages at death, spanning multiple generations of use. This tomb alone has provided invaluable evidence of the genuinely blended cultural identity present at Maresha during this period. A Phoenician, specifically Sidonian, family adopting Greek artistic conventions and the Greek language for their most intimate, permanent family monument, while presumably maintaining other aspects of their own distinct cultural and religious tradition in ways the tomb itself does not fully reveal. But it is not the painted animal frieze, remarkable as it is, that has generated the most persistent, unresolved questions about Maresha's underground world. It is the sheer number and variety of additional cave complexes discovered across the site, many still under active excavation, whose specific purposes and, in several notable cases, whose specific occupants remain genuinely unclear, even after decades of careful archaeological work. Excavations at Maresha have continued intensively since the 1980s, led over the years by archaeologists including Amos Kloner, and have revealed a genuinely staggering density of underground construction beneath the ancient city, literally hundreds of individual cave complexes, many interconnected, serving purposes ranging from the mundane and easily identified, such as olive oil production facilities whose function is confirmed by the physical apparatus still visible within them, to considerably more ambiguous spaces whose original use researchers have had to reconstruct through careful, sometimes tentative inference rather than confident direct evidence. Among the burial caves specifically, archaeologists have documented human remains and associated grave goods reflecting the same cosmopolitan mixture of cultural influence visible in the Sidonian tombs' Greek language inscriptions and Phoenician family identity, but considerably less well documented or explained. Some caves contain burials with grave goods and associated artifacts that suggest specifically Idumean cultural or religious practice, a population whose own beliefs and funerary customs during this particular period remain less thoroughly documented in surviving ancient literary sources than the comparatively well-recorded traditions of the Greek and Jewish populations occupying the broader region during the same centuries. This relative documentary silence around Idumean religious and funerary practice specifically means that archaeologists excavating these particular burial contexts at Maresha are frequently working with considerably less external textual context to help interpret what they find than researchers working on comparable Greek or Jewish burial sites elsewhere in the region. This interpretive gap has proven especially significant regarding a number of burial caves at Maresha, containing what appeared to be deliberately unusual or irregular treatment of human remains, details that resist easy categorization within any single, well-understood cultural or religious framework. Some caves show evidence of secondary burial practices in which remains appear to have been moved, collected, or rearranged after initial interment, a practice documented across various ancient Near Eastern cultures, but whose specific significance at Maresha, given the site's genuinely mixed population, remains difficult to attribute confidently to any single cultural tradition, rather than some locally specific practice that may have developed from the blending of multiple traditions coexisting in close proximity within the same small city. There is also the matter of the site's broader chronology and eventual abandonment, which adds a final, unresolved layer to Maresha's underground mysteries. The city and its extensive cave network appear to have gone through a final period of destruction and abandonment connected to the Hasmonean conquest of Idumea in the late 2nd century BC, a campaign associated with the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty's territorial expansion and, according to some ancient sources, including forced conversion of the conquered Idumean population to Judaism, though the precise nature, extent, and voluntariness of this religious transformation remains genuinely debated among modern historians working from limited and not entirely consistent ancient sources. Did residents of Maresha, anticipating this conquest and the disruption it would bring to their community, use the extensive cave network beneath their city for concealment of either people or property in ways that archaeology has not yet fully identified or confirmed? Some excavated contexts suggest hurried, incomplete activity consistent with a population departing under some degree of urgency, though distinguishing between the normal, gradual attrition of a declining settlement and a more specific documented moment of crisis. Driven abandonment remains methodologically difficult based on the physical evidence alone, without corroborating textual sources describing Maresha's final days in the kind of specific detail available for better documented sites elsewhere in the ancient world. Excavation at Maresha continues today, and new cave complexes are discovered with some regularity as work proceeds across a site whose full underground extent, much like the necropolis at Cyrene explored earlier in this investigation, has never been completely mapped. Each newly opened chamber carries the possibility of resolving some portion of the site's outstanding questions, or, just as often in practice, of adding new ones to a list that has grown steadily longer across 4 decades of careful, ongoing archaeological work. What remains certain is that Mauritia's inhabitants, across the centuries of the city's Hellenistic period prosperity, built downward into that soft chalk bedrock with a persistence and scale that few comparable ancient sites can match, creating a genuinely vast subterranean world whose full purpose, in many of its individual chambers, still resists confident, complete explanation. So the chalk beneath Mauritius keeps its irregular burials and its unmapped chambers in the same patient darkness that has held them since the city's final Hellenistic period residents last walked its underground passages. What specific beliefs, blending Idumean, Sidonian, Greek, and eventually Jewish influence in ways no single surviving text fully explains, shaped how this particular community chose to treat its dead? And beneath hills that archaeologists have already spent 4 decades excavating without reaching a confirmed end to the network below, how many more chambers and how many more unresolved burials remain waiting in that soft, workable stone for the next careful season of digging to finally bring them into the light? Wind moves across a high plateau in the northern Iberian interior, where a hilltop rises above the confluence of 2 rivers, its exposed limestone still bearing in places the faint traces of ditches and ramparts dug by soldiers who besieged this place nearly 22 centuries ago. Little of the ancient city itself remains visible above ground. Low foundation walls, scattered fragments of Iberian pottery, the outline of streets barely discernible in the grass. But the silence here carries a particular weight, because this hilltop, known today as Numancia, holds one of the most extraordinary, and in several respects still genuinely unresolved, sieges in the entire history of Rome's conquest of the ancient world. Numancia sat near the modern Spanish city of Soria, a fortified settlement of the Celtiberian peoples who inhabited the interior of the Iberian Peninsula during the centuries of Roman expansion into Spain. Roman involvement in the region had been ongoing for decades by the time Numancia became the singular focus of Roman military attention, part of the broader, protracted series of conflicts modern historians collectively term the Celtiberian Wars, fought intermittently across the 2nd century BC as Rome worked to extend and consolidate its control over the Iberian interior, following its earlier victories against Carthage in the peninsula. Numancia itself, by most measures, was not an especially large settlement. Ancient population estimates, drawn from the site's physical scale and later historical accounts, suggest a population likely numbering only in the several thousands. And yet this comparatively modest hilltop settlement managed to resist repeated sustained Roman military campaigns across roughly 2 decades, inflicting a series of genuinely humiliating defeats on Roman forces, including, according to ancient sources, at least one instance in which an entire Roman army was forced to surrender and pass under the yoke, a specific ritual of military humiliation reserved by Roman tradition for a defeated force allowed to survive but stripped of any claim to military honor. This sustained resistance, drawn out over decades against the resources of an increasingly powerful Mediterranean empire, eventually prompted Rome to dispatch one of its most capable and experienced generals to finally resolve the situation. Scipio Aemilianus, the same commander who had, several years earlier, overseen the final destruction of Carthage itself in 146 BC, bringing the Third Punic War to its catastrophic conclusion. Scipio's appointment to the Numantine campaign in 134 BC signaled the seriousness with which Rome now regarded this single Celtiberian hilltop settlement, an acknowledgement that conventional military approaches had repeatedly failed to subdue it. Rather than attempting another direct assault, Scipio instead adopted a strategy of complete, methodical siege, constructing an extensive circuit of Roman fortifications encircling Numancia entirely, cutting the settlement off from any outside resupply or reinforcement, and settling in for what would become one of antiquity's most thoroughly documented and archaeologically confirmed siege operations. Roman military camps constructed during this siege have been identified and excavated by modern archaeologists with remarkable precision, offering historians an unusually detailed physical record of Roman siege engineering and military organization during this specific period, providing a level of confirmed archaeological detail that few other ancient sieges anywhere in the Mediterranean world can match. The siege lasted approximately 8 months, according to ancient accounts, primarily preserved through the historian Appian, writing considerably later but apparently drawing on earlier, more contemporary sources now lost. Cut off entirely from outside supply, the population of Numantia was gradually reduced to starvation, and Appian's account describes conditions of genuine horror within the besieged settlement during its final weeks, including explicit claims of cannibalism as the population's food supplies were entirely exhausted. Here is where the historical record, despite its unusual archaeological richness regarding the siege's Roman military dimension, becomes considerably less certain regarding the specific fate of Numantia's defenders and the final days of the settlement itself. Ancient sources, principally Appian, describe the city's eventual capitulation, following the population's recognition that continued resistance had become impossible, and report that the surviving Numantines chose mass suicide rather than surrender to Roman forces, setting fire to their own city and destroying whatever remained of their possessions rather than allowing them to fall into Roman hands as spoils of conquest. This account of collective, deliberate self-destruction rather than surrender has become one of the most enduring elements of Numantia's historical legacy, particularly within later Spanish national memory, where the site has been repeatedly invoked across subsequent centuries as a powerful symbol of resistance against overwhelming external force, a reputation that would later influence Cervantes to write a tragedy based on the siege, and that continues to shape how the site is remembered and presented in Spain today. But the specific, precise details of this final act, how many of Numantia's population actually died by their own hand, rather than through starvation, combat, or eventual surrender and enslavement, how the mass destruction of the city was organized and carried out in its final hours, whether Appian's account reflects genuine, reasonably accurate historical memory, or a degree of dramatic embellishment characteristic of ancient historical writing about famous last stands, remain questions that archaeology alone has not been able to fully confirm or resolve with the same precision available for the siege's better documented military dimensions. Archaeological excavation at Numantia itself, ongoing intermittently since the late 19th century and continuing with more systematic modern methodology in subsequent decades, has confirmed evidence of the settlement's violent final destruction, including burn layers and destruction deposits, consistent with the city's ancient reputation for a catastrophic, fiery end. But translating this physical evidence into a precise, confirmed account of exactly how many residents died, by what specific means, and under what precise sequence of events during those final chaotic hours, remains considerably more difficult than confirming that a violent destruction event occurred at all. The gap between the dramatic, culturally resonant narrative preserved by Appian and the more fragmentary, harder to interpret physical evidence recovered through excavation leaves genuine uncertainty about exactly how much of the traditional Numantia story reflects precise historical fact versus later literary and cultural elaboration built upon a real, but less completely documented historical core. There is also the broader, more genuinely unresolved question of what happened to any Numantine survivors who did not die during the siege's final catastrophic hours. Roman sources indicate that some portion of the population was taken captive following the city's fall, but detailed information about the subsequent fate of these survivors, where they were sent, how they were incorporated or not into the broader Roman provincial system in Spain, whether any distinct Numantine cultural identity persisted among their descendants in any traceable form, remains sparse. Another gap in the historical record that the site's unusually rich archaeological documentation of the siege's military dimension has not been able to fully close. Numantia's ruins remain preserved today as a significant archaeological and historical site in Spain, its excavated Roman siege camps offering researchers an unusually complete physical record of ancient siege warfare, even as the human story of the settlement's final defenders and their ultimate fate remains only partially resolved between ancient literary tradition and the more fragmentary physical evidence recovered from the hilltop itself. So the wind continues to move across that Iberian plateau, over ground that has given up considerable evidence about how Rome finally subdued this stubborn hilltop settlement, while still withholding the fullest, most precise account of exactly how its final defenders met their end. Did Numantia's population truly choose collective self-destruction over surrender? in the totality that Appian's account suggests? Or does that dramatic tradition simplify a messier, more fragmented final chapter that archaeology has only begun to reconstruct? And somewhere beneath that quiet Spanish hilltop, among burn layers and scattered fragments already excavated across more than a century of careful work, what remains of Numantia's true last hours is still waiting for the physical evidence to finally catch up with the legend that has outlived it. Far to the east of Numantia's windswept plateau, past the Mediterranean world entirely, past even the Hellenistic frontier cities of Bactria explored earlier in this investigation, lies one of the most inhospitable stretches of terrain on the planet. The Tarim Basin, in what is now China's Xinjiang region, a vast desert bowl ringed by towering mountain ranges, dominated at its center by the Taklamakan Desert, a name that some translations render ominously as the place of no return. It is precisely this brutal aridity, however, that has preserved something the desert's harsh conditions would seem far more likely to destroy than protect: the remarkably intact remains of an ancient people whose origins remain even now genuinely contested among the scientists studying them. Beginning in the early 20th century and continuing with increasing scientific rigor through subsequent decades, archaeologists working in the Tarim Basin's desert cemeteries began uncovering mummified human remains of extraordinary preservation, their bodies naturally desiccated by the region's extreme dryness rather than through any deliberate embalming process, their clothing, hair, and even facial features remaining visible in a way rarely achieved through natural preservation processes anywhere else in the world. These mummies, collectively known to researchers as the Tarim Basin mummies or Tarim mummies, date across a remarkably long span, from roughly 2000 BC through the early centuries AD, representing not a single population or moment in time, but a lengthy, layered sequence of human habitation in one of the world's most extreme environments. What immediately struck early researchers examining these remains, and what has continued to generate genuine scientific debate across the following century, was the mummy's physical appearance, features that many early 20th century observers described as strikingly different from surrounding East Asian populations, including notably light-colored hair in several specimens, and clothing styles, particularly among the earliest burials, that bore resemblances to textile traditions more commonly associated with populations far to the west, across Central Asia, and toward Europe. This observation set off decades of scientific speculation, complicated considerably by the politically fraught history of research into the Tarim mummies, given the site's location in a region whose contemporary ethnic and political composition makes questions of ancient population origin considerably more sensitive than comparable archaeological questions elsewhere in the world. Early theories proposed connections to Indo-European populations migrating eastward from the Eurasian steppe, potentially linking the earliest Tarim inhabitants to broader patterns of Bronze Age migration that some linguists and archaeologists have connected to the spread of Indo-European languages across a vast swath of Eurasia, from India to Europe, during roughly this same broad historical period. For decades, these questions remained largely unresolved, constrained by the limitations of purely morphological and archaeological analysis, unable to move beyond informed speculation toward genuine scientific confirmation. This changed significantly with the application of increasingly sophisticated genetic analysis to the preserved remains, particularly a major study published in 2021 in the journal Nature, conducted by an international team of researchers who successfully extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from a substantial sample of Tarim Basin mummies spanning the full range of the site's long chronological sequence. The genetic findings proved genuinely surprising, complicating rather than simply confirming the earlier migration-based theories that had dominated speculation for decades. Rather than representing a population of recent steppe migrants, as many earlier researchers had proposed based primarily on physical appearance and cultural material, the genetic analysis revealed that the earliest Tarim Basin mummies were, in fact, predominantly descended from an extremely ancient, genetically distinct population, one that appeared to have remained remarkably isolated for thousands of years prior to their appearance in the Tarim Basin archaeological record, showing genetic ancestry connected to a broader ancient North Eurasian population without the specific admixture patterns that would be expected from recent large-scale steppe migration. This finding suggested something genuinely unexpected. Rather than being newcomers who had recently migrated into the Tarim Basin from elsewhere, bringing steppe-derived genetics and culture with them, the earliest mummies appeared to represent the descendants of a population that had remained substantially isolated within, or very near, the Tarim Basin region itself for a considerable span of time, adopting cultural practices and material culture, including certain textile technologies and agricultural practices such as wheat and dairy cultivation, from surrounding populations through cultural exchange and trade, without the accompanying large-scale genetic mixing that such extensive cultural adoption might otherwise suggest. If this genetic interpretation holds up under continued research and scrutiny, it represents a genuinely significant revision to earlier understanding of Central Asian population history, suggesting a considerably more complex, layered picture of ancient human movement, isolation, and cultural exchange across this critical Eurasian crossroads region than the earlier, simpler migration narratives had proposed. The mummy's distinctive physical features, rather than indicating direct recent descent from Western Eurasian steppe populations, may instead reflect this deep, ancient genetic isolation, preserved for millennia within a small, geographically constrained population, before eventually beginning to show later admixture with neighboring populations in mummies, dating to more recent periods within the site's long chronological sequence. This resolution, however, while genuinely significant scientifically, has not fully closed the broader mystery surrounding the Tarim Basin mummies and their origins. Questions remain regarding exactly how and why this ancient isolated population came to occupy one of the most extreme, challenging environments on the planet in the first place, and how they managed to sustain viable communities there across such an extended span of time, adapting to and adopting agricultural and pastoral technologies from surrounding populations, including specifically wheat cultivation and dairy production, technologies with origins well outside the immediate Tarim Basin region, while apparently maintaining substantial genetic isolation from the populations who originally developed these technologies elsewhere. The mummy's remarkably well-preserved clothing and grave goods add further texture to these unresolved questions without fully resolving them. Some burials include elaborately woven textiles employing techniques and patterns whose closest comparative parallels appear in sites considerably distant from the Tarim Basin, raising ongoing questions about the specific mechanisms of cultural transmission that could account for such technological and stylistic connections across such considerable distances, in the apparent absence of the large-scale population movement that might most straightforwardly explain them. Trade networks, occasional smaller-scale migration or intermarriage insufficient to substantially alter the broader population's genetic profile, or some combination of gradual cumulative cultural exchange across many generations, have all been proposed as potential mechanisms, though no single explanation has yet achieved full scientific consensus regarding precisely how these specific technologies and stylistic influences reached such a remote, isolated population. There is also the matter of what became of this distinctive early Tarim population over the following centuries, as later burials in the site's long chronological sequence do show increasing genetic admixture with neighboring populations, suggesting that whatever isolation characterized the earliest phase of Tarim Basin habitation gradually broke down over subsequent centuries, as the region became more thoroughly integrated into broader patterns of Central Asian trade, migration, and eventually the network of routes that would later develop into what modern historians call the Silk Road. Tracing the precise timeline and mechanisms of this gradual integration, and understanding exactly what happened to the distinctive early population's specific genetic and cultural identity as it blended into these broader regional patterns, remains an active area of ongoing genetic and archaeological research without complete resolution currently available. The Taklamakan Desert continues to yield additional mummified remains as archaeological survey and excavation work proceeds, each new discovery offering additional genetic and material evidence that continues to refine and periodically complicate scientific understanding of exactly who these remarkably preserved ancient people were, and how they came to inhabit and for so long sustain themselves within one of the most inhospitable environments anywhere on Earth. So the desert's extraordinary dryness continues to hold its silent, remarkably preserved dead, their genetic origins now considerably better understood than they were even a decade ago. Yet their full story of isolation, cultural exchange, and eventual gradual integration into the wider currents of ancient Eurasian history, still only partially reconstructed. What sustained this genetically isolated population across so many centuries in such an unforgiving landscape, and what finally brought their long isolation to an end? And beneath the same relentless sand that has already preserved so much, how many more silent, weathered faces remain waiting, their own individual stories of survival at the edge of the habitable world still entirely unknown to the researchers who have only begun to understand the ones the desert has already surrendered?